Okay, let me just share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Yes, I see.
Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful. Well, welcome everyone to our second installment of the Orang Asli Wellbeing webinar. Today, before we get started, I just want to run through a few of the introductory points from last time. But just as a reminder, the goal of this webinar is to bring together scholars from a variety of backgrounds to address current challenges for Orang Asli health and well-being. And in doing so, we hope to foster informal and formal networks of discussion and collaboration for future basic and applied research. The ultimate goal is to improve the health and well-being outcomes among the Orang Asli. So last time we visited some long-term perspectives on Orang Asli change. Today we move forward with some new topics. And just as a reminder to those who weren't with us last time, we will be having 2 more sessions following this next Tuesday and then the Tuesday after that at the same time as this one. And for anyone who missed our first session, it's now been posted online. You can view it there. And the session today will also be posted online for you to revisit or to send the link to those who can't make it. Just to give us an idea of what the sort of organizational format is for today. So just like last time, participants will be muted during the talks. We'll let the speakers go through their entire talks before we have questions. We do ask speakers to please stick to their allocated time between 20 and 25 minutes. And then following each talk, we will have a brief question and answer session. You'll have your chance to ask 1 or 2 questions. And then at the very end, we'll have a discussion where anyone can chime in. You can either use the raise hand feature or you can type your questions directly into the chat box. We had some really nice discussion for quite a while at the end of our last session. And then finally, please feel free to contact us if you have any technical issues whatsoever at the addresses shown below. Okay, and with that, our Rodney Obian, our co-organizer from Keene State College, will give a brief introduction before we begin.
Thank you, Tom. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. On behalf of Keene State College in Keene, New Hampshire in the United States, I want to welcome you to the second session of the Orang Asli Health and Wellbeing Conference. My name again is Rodney Obian. I am college archivist and I curate the Orang Asli archive housed in the Mason Library at Keene State. The Orang Asli archive was established in 2000 as a repository to document and share the history and culture of the Orang Asli. The collections consist of over 20 linear meters of papers, publications, photographs, artifacts, and over 3,000 digital images and objects. So to learn more, come visit us online at library.keene.edu/archives. I'll post this web link and my email address in the chat box. So again, on behalf of Keene State College and the Orang Asli Archive, welcome, and I hope you enjoy the program. So I'll turn it over to you again, Tom.
Thank you, Rodney. I'll just share my screen again. Okay. Well, thank you, Rodney. So during the first session of this series, we heard from an accomplished group of speakers who have conducted long-term ethnographic work in Malaysia. These speakers provided us with a detailed look into what life was like for some Orang Asli peoples in the past, as well as some insight into how life has changed for many of those Orang Asli over the past few decades. Through this ethnographic lens, we gain a rich qualitative understanding of the key factors affecting Orang Asli health and well-being and how some of these health challenges facing Orang Asli today are new and maybe especially difficult. As we laid out in the beginning of this webinar, connecting interdisciplinary knowledge of Orang Asli health over time is one of the central goals of these sessions. And as such, our speakers today will move this program forward by building on the insights from our first session and exploring a variety of topics that affect contemporary Orang Asli health. So these include historical perspectives on Orang Asli health from Dr. Sandra Manickam, the role of genetics from Drs. Maude Phipps and Amanda Leah, the rise of novel health threats in the form of chronic non-communicable diseases from Dr. Ian Wallace, and finally a description of the challenges surrounding displacement facing Timiar people by Dr. Andy Hickson. So with that, it is my great pleasure today to introduce our very first speaker, Dr. Sandra Manickam. Dr. Manickam is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Erasmus University, Rotterdam, and her work takes a historical approach to understand the intersection between medicine and broader society. And she has published widely on Malaysia and the Orang Asli specifically, including an excellent book titled Taming the Wild: Aborigines and Racial Knowledge in Colonial Malaya. And so with that, I will turn the floor over to Sandra to get us started.
Hi, Tom, thanks. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I hope this goes well. Yep, do people see my screen?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to go to full screen now. Okay, well, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Rodney and Vivek, for all your work in organizing this conference. As already mentioned, my name is Sandra Manickam, and it's a pleasure to be here to meet virtually some of you for the first time, and others after quite a long hiatus. For me, this conference comes at a time when I'm in the process of meshing two research projects together. After my work on the history of anthropology of Orang Asli in the colonial period, I began researching the history of medicine in Malaya more broadly, starting from the colonial period again, going through the Japanese occupation, and then going through towards the British occupation, British reoccupation, and present day developments. I'm making my way slowly and surely to talking about the present day interests in indigenous people's health and genetics, and specifically how that relates to earlier knowledge formations in the colonial period. The first day of the conference was very interesting to me because, yeah, many people were talking about the 1960s and 70s onwards, and my interest is just kind of the period before that, kind of the pre-history to that, and to see how those new ideas, so those old ideas related to those new ideas. And my interest in a way is in asking why the interest in Orang Asli health at this time, post-war onwards, why the specific kind of interest, so blood, nutrition, disease profile, and how does this relate to earlier studies on racial categorization and current interest in race in Malaysian life, and in population genetics in scientific life. And I think as has been shown quite well in the first installment of this conference, these are not just academic questions or historical questions. Health inequalities within society is a subset of inequalities more generally. It's not just a matter of health, but it's a matter of social, political, and economic conditions as well. Orang Asli, along with many other indigenous peoples, have been the subject or target of so-called cutting-edge scientific and medical developments since the 19th century. They've been poked and prodded at with the latest technologies, photographs as examples of savages with new imaging technologies, plaster casts taken of their faces towards the point of suffocation, and bodily fluids and material taken with or without their consent. And this is all happening without necessarily, as we saw from last week, a realization of them as respected subjects, and often in a quite demeaning manner, especially when it comes to anthropological history or even medical historical knowledge. Earlier ideas of racial uniqueness and inferiority come back in different guises. And for me, it's very interesting to see how these scientific developments, these newer scientific developments, kind of piggyback in some ways on some of those earlier ideas, and how they come back and might actually cause further disempowerment for these communities. So for me, it's useful to think about the similarities in the history of medicine, where other groups have been the objects of medical knowledge, disciplining, and discrimination, and often in conjunction with state endeavors like legislation and invasive procedures. For instance, among sex workers, leprosy patients, plantation workers in colonial history. And what we heard last week about the forced birth control given without Orang Asli knowledge was especially troubling. So this is a couple of things I'm going to be showing you on my slides. Some things just to show you how the interest has changed from the pre-war to the post-war. This is something that was already shown, shared by Tom previously, by Ivan Polonin, and the Medical National History of Malayan Aborigines. And I'll come back to this in a short while. Health has a moral order. Years ago, there was a fascinating exhibition about colonial history of Malaya in the NUS Museum, where a lot of Ivan Polonin's personal papers were used to talk about medicine and health in Malaya. His work with Orang Asli and their health beliefs and practices show that, similar to what was spoken about by Signa Howell last week, that health and sickness relate to ideas of a cosmic order and culture. And this was a fascinating exhibition. You can see like his papers and photographs and materials were put on exhibit, and there were captions. There was a nice kind of series of talks. I haven't actually been able to kind of locate a lot of the material here, even though there's some material in ICES in Singapore. What really struck me about this museum exhibit was not just that health has a moral and a cosmic order for Orang Asli, but that we all have certain ideas and values attached to health. And these are also by our Western anthropologists in the historical period, where judgment and treatment of health is linked to older judgments about Orang Asli bodies and their fitness for certain lifeways, climate, and environments. So we have ideas that Orang Asli bodies are adaptable to the environment to the extent that some older anthropologists expected them to have features of animals living in the jungle, like gills, if they were Orang Laut. On the flip side, there are also assumptions about Orang Asli bodies as ill-adapted bodies, unhealthy, diseased, and with a short life expectancy, especially in relation to the modern world. Simplistic views of Orang Asli bodies and health often permeate discussions about health and form the basis of inaction or an excuse for poor conditions brought on by forces outside of these communities' control. This paper is the start to try to understand the Malaysian history of health and medicine, and to understand how different groups are thought of and placed within the moral order of health through time. It builds on the work of those such as Lenore Manderson, Carol Lederman, and Harun Hairudin, who have dealt with similar issues, but not necessarily with the same focus. And it's especially interesting to see the changes in interest in Orang Asli that took place in the immediate post-war period, and how differently Orang Asli were approached in the decades before then. There are several reasons for this change, which relate to conditions within Malaya, but also international health initiatives of which Malaysia was a part. The first thing to note about the history of health and medicine in Malaya is that it was very much linked to supporting economic development, and unabashedly so. Interest in preventing and treating disease was predicated on seeing the effects in the labor force who was suffering. In this way, Malaya's history of medicine and health focused very much on migrant labor, which was the backbone of colonial economy. Two diseases were of special interest, particularly for the Institute of Medical Research here on the left, shown in the picture. Beriberi, because it led to Chinese laborers falling ill and dying, and malaria, because it made the opening up of the jungle difficult and Indian plantation workers ill and unable to work. In many cases, businessmen and not government officials made the case for health legislation because they saw the economic benefits of keeping their workforce healthy. The colonial government became responsible for preventing disease, and increasing levels of public health brought on by capitalist expansion, creating the moral and intellectual basis for colonial rule. In 1912, the Institute of Medical Research here was founded and became involved in public health as opposed to merely investigating coolie, as they said, coolie-related diseases. And all of this, I mean, when it comes to health and medicine in Malaya, it was also very much part of the spread of Western superiority and Western medicine. And it was also seen as a conquest of British administration and science over natives and nature alike. And if you see on the right, this is a kind of a diagram of the 50th anniversary of the Institute of Medical Research in 1951. And you can see the natural progression of, in this case, well, medical systems in Malaya, where the Western one is taken superior hold over Malay, Aboriginal, Ayurvedic, and Chinese. Yeah, so Western medicine was used to wrestle thousands of acres of jungle from oblivion, from not being able to be developed, into and turning it into productive land. Malcolm Watson gushed that with wealth comes health, and from hundreds of square miles of malaria, which formerly exacted a heavy toll, from Malay and foreigner alike, this has then been driven out by virtue of these health initiatives. What the foregoing description highlights is that the development of medicine and health policy was very targeted on specific populations and due to economic interest. British soldiers in the EIC period, British colonial officers, then Chinese and Indian migrant laborers were the subjects of medical intervention because of their importance in the development of Malaya. This had somewhat of an urban-rural divide. The main cities were the subjects of public health policies, but also tin mining areas and plantations, which would be located in rural areas. It appears that the village and forest dwellers, unless they were close by to these areas of development, were not systematically brought under public health. And indeed, the idea of public health was very limited to the public that was connected to colonial enterprises. This meant both that the Malays and Orang Asli were left outside of the targets of colonial medicine initially, other than as representations of good colonial governance, indicative of the increasing concern about rural health in the 1920s onwards. It's difficult to find specific information in the colonial period regarding Orang Asli health. The interest may be divided into two parts, which include medicine. For instance, the interest in Orang Asli medical knowledge, seen as indigenous medicine centered on herbs and jungle produce, and often linked to magical practices among Orang Asli and Malay communities. And number two, the odd comment or report from census or medical officials or anthropologists who were in contact with Orang Asli communities and interested in aspects other than the usual anthropological aspects. And here you can see again that in the whole history of medicine in Malaya, again from the Institute of Medical Research retrospective, so to speak, pagan medicine, as it says, was part of this overall development of medicine within Malaya, and with, of course, some diagrams and some drawings there as well. In this sense, Noon in 1936 was one of the first to comment specifically on health as a matter of public concern and not only in anthropological descriptive terms. Already in 1936, he had noted in his report on the Plate Tamiar that the Tamiar have proved themselves again and again to have a more modern appreciation of European medicine than most Malays. And here he quotes some medical annual reports from 1933 and 1932. And he goes on to say that he has personally found first aid the trump card in gaining their confidence, and medical work must always be an essential feature of any scheme implemented for Aboriginal welfare. And this is quite unusual. I mean, I think the 1930s is actually quite late for thinking about Orang Asli health, whereas before a lot of the interest was basically in measuring, in locating, in identifying, and not necessarily about health. So this was already quite unusual for this time. There was a clear shift in emphasis towards Orang Asli health due to the post-war scenario and the communist insurgency. This can be seen to be linked to the following: nutritional surveys, which were popular worldwide, and in Malaya focused on rural and impoverished areas, to the extent that this is an image from the cover of the medical for 1949, and they made it a point to kind of advertise how good they were taking of Malaya's people by showing, in this case, Malay schoolgirls enjoying milk. And related to this, anemia surveys, which were then linked to taking a look at Orang Asli, and then which became the basis for blood group anthropology and health interventions. In addition to that, our interest in Orang Asli health was also linked to the maltreatment and malnutrition at the hands of the communists due to guerrilla warfare situation. And thanks very much, I think, to Jeffrey for suggesting buying The Jungle Nurse, which came just a few days ago and was very interesting. And her story really exemplifies this, that Orang Asli came to her because they were having trouble with nutrition and getting enough food and the like. And here you can see more images of medicine and medical endeavors and health endeavors. So the one on the left is vaccination of a Sakai girl, as it says here. But on the right, there was also training courses and papers on applied nutrition. And these were often focused on impoverished or rural areas, which include rural Indians, rural Malays, and as a subset as well, Orang Asli at the same time. So before the Japanese occupation and just after, reports on Orang Asli were in the Journal for the Federated Malay States Museums, or the Bulletin of the Raffles Museum. So these were actually non-medical journals, but journals that are related to specifically anthropological or museum topics. There was almost no mention of Orang Asli health or treatment in the regular Malayan medical journal, which is the foremost journal at that time. After the war, as can be seen from the 1949 annual report and photographs accompanying it, the buzzwords were nutritional surveys, public health and social medicine, as well as rural health. And Ivan Pulanin found himself in one of these departments in the National University of Singapore. And this meant that Malays and Orang Asli were now starting to be of interest to the colonial government and the government in general, but also underprivileged groups of Chinese, Indians, and Orang Asli. I will go towards the end of my presentation by looking at, by linking this talk to some findings from an article written some years ago on blood group anthropology. I began the paper by asking why the interest in Orang Asli health at this time, post-war onwards, not to doubt the need for such interest, but in a rather kind of looking at a historical perspective to see why this particular health at this time and what can that tell us about the interests of the powers that be in Orang Asli health and how that plays into maybe other kinds of trends nationally, but also internationally. So why the specific kind of interest in blood, nutrition, and disease profile, and how this relates to my earlier studies on racial categorization and the current interest in race in Malaysian life. The rise of interest in Orang Asli health is due to the confluence of international health initiatives and consortium involving several states in which certain issues and diseases, nutrition, malaria, scrub typhus, for instance, became prominent. This meant an extension of the old limited purview of health initiatives from the economically important laborers to the public, or the idea of a public health, which included Orang Asli. And of course, this inclusion of Orang Asli in this idea of public was also convenient for colonial government because it was a way to gain sympathy against communists and against communism, and in a way thus killing two birds with one stone. At the same time, the interest in health and the development of medical technologies was very clearly geared towards looking at patients according to their community groupings, and this has been a feature of health and medical treatment in Malaya. And in the case of Orang Asli, in figuring out racial relationships and race formation. And this is just the table of contents from, I think this is Ivan Polunin's paper, post-war, where along with looking at the medical natural history of the Orang Asli, part of it was also the beginning of looking at gene frequencies and interest in what that would say about their history and especially their migratory history. Blood types was the first generation of human population genetics, and is of interest to me here because of the links to present-day genetic studies and its reliance on former physical anthropology. And in a sense, the conclusions came about by Polunin was in saying that actually it doesn't, in this case, blood groups do not actually tell us very much about their history, and physical anthropology would have said more about this matter. What this sketch hopes to achieve is to show how health and medicine Malaya developed, how it was never only or just an altruistic endeavor, and that the population makeup of Malaya led to health interventions based on racial groupings, which of course are linked to lifestyle and social groupings, medical knowledge that relied heavily on racial groupings. And Orang Asli, from a marginal position in the thinking of health in Malaya, was drawn into this sphere by virtue of the post-war world and the communist insurgency. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandra. I believe we have time for one or two questions. If anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask a question for Dr. Manickam, or type a question into the chat box.
Could I just put something in here? Ivan Polunin's study was explicitly done in the resettlement camps during the emergency, which of course he regarded as a, if you like, pathological situation. He was very explicit about that. So maybe one could build models of ill health that results from such circumstances beyond just Orang Asli, in fact.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Jeff, because one of the things that when people, at least later historians of Orang Asli, when they use Pulunin's work, they actually often take it as a picture of Orang Asli in their natural state, this 1950s report, when in fact he was very obviously, he was saying this is due to resettlement. This is far from what they were in, or the state that they were in before the war. And yeah, and he was very explicit about that. So I think one of the things that for me was very interesting was that that at some point, people were very keen on information on Orang Asli health, and in fact, this unique situation was taken as the benchmark when actually it was an exceptional case already.
Okay, any other questions for Sandra?
Hi, Sandra. Thank you for your presentation. Just a question. I was intrigued when you mentioned that there was some investigator and a group of investigators that somehow expected some Orang Asli groups like the Orang Selatan to have gills. I mean, what's the logic behind that?
Yeah, no, Maude, that was a very interesting thing in the mid to late 1800s. So when anthropologists were first coming, actually even Skeet, when he first came here, they were basically saying that, we now across the world, people are trying to find for the missing link between humans and certain certain apes, and then they thought that they had been looking for this in other places, have not found it, and they thought that okay, maybe we would find this in Malaya, but also that other kinds of natural selection processes would have taken place to the extent that they thought, oh yeah, we wouldn't be surprised if we actually found gills on some of these individuals. That very quickly went away, but that was very much part of that imagination that that natural selection somehow would actually then propel certain people to be so adapted to their environment, and then this was a way in which we can see that.
All right, thank you. Most bizarre, but nevertheless, people have wild imaginations.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, and that's a good segue to our next speaker, Dr. Maude Phipps. We just heard from a bit. So Dr. Phipps is a professor of human genetics at the Jeffrey Chia School of Medicine and Health Sciences at Monash University, Malaysia. She completed her PhD in human molecular genetics at the University of Cambridge in the UK, before returning to Malaysia, where she is a leading researcher on the genetics, health, and population history of peoples in Asia and Oceania. Her internationally recognized work on a variety of topics, which include cardiometabolic health, genetics, human microbiome, brings a high level of rigor and scientific detail to the study of Orang Asli health. So we're very pleased to have her join us here today, and I believe we may hear from some of her students as well. So please take it away, Maude.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you to Vivek and Rodney and all the organizers. It's thrilling for me to finally meet Professor Kurt Endicott online. I've heard so much about Kurt and quite a number of greats here who paved the way for many of us who took up Orang Asli research later on. So can I just say I would like to record a vote of thanks to Adela Bear, because she was the one who actually inspired a lot of our work with Orang Asli communities in biomedical sciences. I'm not sure if she's here today, but she was really inspirational. The early work she did with Lee In-jo at the Institute of Medical Research and so on. So thank you very much, Dee. If you're watching this, it's really, terrific, and I wish you all the best. I did ask the organizers to just give us a little bit of extra time, because I believe that we really should push our young investigators forward. And I'm sharing this session with two of my PhD students who will tell you a little bit about some current work that they are undertaking. So I beg your indulgence in allowing us a little bit more time, maybe 25 minutes, and we'll try and keep it sort of, within time. So I will try and share my screen now, and let's see what happens. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Great. Okay, so it works, but I'm sure Tom will rescue us if there's any technical problem. Right. So the topic mainly is, as Tom mentioned, a few things that we've done over the years are mainly based on engaging our communities in Malaysia, and specifically the last hunter-gatherers, the Negritos in the country. And my training, I suppose, to a certain extent, makes me look at it from a very genomics and also health perspective. Right, so a vote of thanks to all these people without whom our work would not be possible. So I thought this slide is just thanking quite a number of people, but specifically the Orang Asli communities throughout Malaysia that have worked with us and who've been very, very gracious in welcoming us into their communities. A vote of thanks to Julie Ido. Some of you might know Julie, I'm not sure if he's here, and the JAKOA, Jabatan Kemajuan Orang Asli. Colin Nicholas, I think, is here. And MOSTI is the Malaysian Science, Technology and Innovation Ministry, and the Ministry of Education. Lundbeck and the Leakey Foundations have funded our work. And there are many other people here that I will not mention by name, but their names are here. Kirk might know Saito Naruya, and we are collaborating with him in National Institute of Genetics in Japan. Yes, I mentioned the young people. So these are the up and coming researchers, Dr. Fahang Agakanian, Dr. Tim Jinam, who's now in Japan. Tim is Bidayo. He is a native of Borneo. This is Li Fang. You will hear from her later. This is Zimei, Dr. Jeffrey, young Dr. Jeffrey, and this is Dr. Herman. So we've got quite a number of medical graduates who are interested in rural health, are doing some exciting research. Right, so we knew this many years ago when the Human Genome Project was proposed, and it seemed quite ridiculous to think of the human genome from just a few people, it's not representative. So we thought that there was this dearth of information about genomics, especially in Asian communities. And this was a publication in Nature that actually shows you that in 2009, out of these 373 studies where people have looked at 1.7 million individuals whose genomes were sequenced, 96 of that was people with European ancestry. And there was only 4% of individuals, humans that were sequenced, who were non-Europeans. And this is such a skew in terms of what we know about the human genome. 7 years down the line, 2016, 2,511 studies, 35 million samples. It's getting a little bit better, 19% non-European. And if we look at these dark blue, radiant dark blue down here, these are the native peoples. So even today, there is a dearth, and genomics is actually failing us on diversity. And I think we better do something to address that. So the impetus for our work over the years, and I started quite late in 2004, 2005, thereabouts, was that with all these huge projects in genetics and genomics and linking that to health, HapMap, the Human Genome Diversity Project, the 1,000 Genomes, and so on, they continue to miss a vast portion of the world's genetic variation in Southeast Asia, right? So if we look at the data, African, Latin American, Hispanic, and indigenous peoples represent less than 4% of all samples analyzed to date. And that's really low. And as we know, and you all are very well versed, these are the most vulnerable and traditionally underserved populations who have in the past and still continue in some parts of the world today to be subject to parachute research. Parachute research is a terminology that we use in the Pan-Asia Hugo Consortium that describes researchers coming from different countries, foreign countries, just coming into the country, getting the samples, taking them out. And at the end of the day, it's parachute research. There is no benefit to the communities. There's no benefit to these countries themselves. And we believe in the School of Medicine and in our society and our organization that it's very important to study underrepresented populations and try to ensure that the benefits of research are distributed fairly and also to maximize potential for discovery. So this photograph was taken some 10 years ago of our team. And you can see that this is a multidisciplinary team comprising our resident at the time, anthropologist, or rather a good friend, Julie Edo here, biomed scientists, myself, and a few others. We are geneticists, biochemists, pathologists, and so on. The clinicians who are very dedicated, Professor Khalid Kadir, Badaria, and Siti. Lab technicians, we have a photographer here, and this is a Kensu community elder and the children. All right, so oftentimes when we actually do field work, we actually go as a multidisciplinary team. It's not just the geneticists, it's also providing healthcare to the community. Right, so some of you are probably very familiar with these communities. So one of the three Orang Asli groups, if you like, or three categories, and we have worked with some of these communities all over the country. So this is a particular slide that just shows you some of the people that we've worked with, some communities, and specifically the Negrito, which are colored here in green. And we have engaged with the Jehai in the Belum, Royal Belum, the Batik in the Mendrik near Gua Musang, and also the Kensu in Bukit Asu near Baling and Kedah, right? So this is the distribution of the Negrito communities. Next up would be the Sonoy communities, and the Sonoy are Austroasiatic speakers, as some of you know, and we have to work with several communities, the Mahmari of Sisi here near Carey Island, the Chewong and the Semai from Cameron Highlands. And the third group that we have engaged over the years are the Proto-Malays. And these Proto-Malays include what Sandra mentioned, the Orang Selata in Johor, very close to our clinical campus in Johor Bahru. So this is here in yellow, the Aboriginal Malays. So this is a sort of a demographic distribution of the communities that we have engaged over the years. Right, so if we go back to looking at human migrations, I think this is a human population model that we sort of still utilize that is derived from mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome, and also autosomal analysis, and I'll get to this in a bit, that postulates that for today's population of more than 7 billion individuals all over the planet, it would have only required an effective ancestral population of about 10,000 people who migrated out of Africa approximately 100,000 to 60,000 years ago. So these are approximates. Of course, we can't have very, it really is not extremely accurate, okay, but it's a good approximation. So for those of you, just bear with me, for those of you who are not very familiar, this is just a very quick primer where genomes, the complete genetic blueprint of each individual, are essential for making any life form, human, bacterial, COVID-19, and so on. And the basic chemical is DNA or RNA. We happen to have DNA as our genetic material. Some viruses are RNA viruses, including HIV. So if we look at this cartoon of the human family, father, mother, and child here, and if you look at any of our cells, this is just a schematic, we have a nucleus within the cell, and the nucleus contains the nuclear genome. And the nuclear genome is organized into chromosomes. So humans have 46 chromosomes in total. We have 44 autosomes and 2 sex chromosomes. So generally, males would have XY and females XX. And this is actually a micrograph of the chromosomes that when we actually treat and actually do DNA extractions, we can actually take out the chemical, which is DNA. So you see here DNA that's suspended in alcohol, and we can use this DNA as our material to study genetics. So this is one of the earlier papers that we published as a consortium. So we formed a consortium among 10 countries. There were about 90 of us from 40 institutions, right from India to Korea to Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, and so on. And we actually engaged all these communities distributed all over Asia, from India right to Japan and Indonesian islands, Korea, and so on. Some of these were archival samples that we use for comparison, the Yoruba in Africa, Central Europeans in America, and so on. And this particular consortium was the first to actually map human genetic diversity in Asia. This was done in 2009 and published in Science at the time. What we found, so this was something that was quite interesting. What we found when we analyzed 50,000 bits of DNA, so now we can analyze 5 million at a go. At the time, it was pretty sexy to analyze 50,000, was that with the exception of India, and if you can look at this diagram here, these dark greens, IN meaning India, with the exception of India that formed their own clade, this is the most recent common ancestor. This is the Yoruba out of Africa. All Asian populations, the whole lot here, from the Chinese Uyghur, right down to the Japanese, the Ryukyuan and the Okinawan people, they form a monophyletic clade, which means they're all from that same single entry of modern humans into Southeast Asia and East Asia. So I guess this was some evidence that showed us that this is what it looked like. And these are the language groups that we can segregate these communities to. So what are our findings? Firstly, genetic ancestry is strongly correlated with linguistic affiliations and geography, which is, of course, a no-brainer, but it was, some evidence. There was relatedness within ethnic and linguistic groups. And to our surprise, 90% of East Asian haplotypes, East Asian mean Chinese, Japanese, Korean, were found in Southeast Asia or Central Southeast Asia, which indicated to us that there was so much more diversity in the South compared to the North, and that Southeast Asia was a major geographic source of East Asian populations. All right, so this was also published in Science at the same time, depicting out of Africa migration along the coasts of India, and then here in Southeast Asia, before further movement north and then east and then south. So this was, and we have established the Pan-Asian SNP database. The data is there free of charge for anyone who would like to use it. So the next thing we did, because when we look at autosomal DNA, which is in the nucleus, it's very difficult to actually provide any timing. So in order to provide timing, we turn our eyes to the mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited only from the mother. And mitochondria provides us with a sort of a molecular clock. The DNA undergoes mutations, which we can actually time. So mitochondria gives an approximate about the time frame. And if you look here, this is a year before the present, 50,000, 100,000, 150,000. And this LO line is a very ancient African line, which gave rise subsequently to the M Manju and the N, the Nassim line. And the lineages go back to 160,000 to the M at about 53,000 before the present, and the N 55,000 years ago. So here we have just a schematic. This is from MitoMap. You can actually have a look at that if you're interested. And these are the haplotypes in Africa. We will only get the L types in Africa and nowhere else in the world. And as humans moved out of Africa and changes occurred and mutations occurred, the lines diverged to here, the main Manju, as I mentioned, the Nassim. And within Asia, there was a diversion and a mutation to the different types of mitochondrial DNA that we see today. And this is Europe, okay? So we can actually get a geographical distribution. And when we looked at our Orang Asli here, the Jehai, the Kenshu, the Mandrik, the Timon, Batik, they were quite distinct from the continental Southeast Asians that were on this end of the PCA and the island Southeast Asians. All right, so this shows that they occupy quite a unique place. And here we have in between the Bidayo from Borneo, Semelai and the Seletar, and the Termiang up here. What does this tell us in terms of time frame? So in terms of time frame, we look at the phylogeny, mainly the tree, the family tree, and also age estimates. And if you just concentrate on these, so I'll just point out these diamonds, these red diamonds, given the approximation of timelines. All right, so this is years before the present, 10,000, 20,000, 40,000, and 60,000. And you will notice that the Temuan, the Jehai, the Bidayo, here we have T, Temuan again, and so on, have ancestries that are approximately 10 to 30,000 years ago in terms of the mitochondria, right? So the haplogroups, which have a mainland continental origins with ages of 30 to 10,000 years ago, account for the majority of what we see in these Austronesian groups in Malaysia. So what we have, and we've published this, is a map of plausible migrations that have been timed into Southeast Asia. So if we take the out of Africa being about 60,000 years ago, these were the first migrations, followed by what we've proposed to be an early train, which occurred between 30,000 to 10,000 years before the present, followed by the express train migration of peoples coming down from Taiwan into Borneo and so on. And this is sometimes called the Austronesian expansion or the out of Taiwan hypothesis to the present day, from about 2,000 years ago to the present. So it gives us some indication of time frame. Now, the third area that we are very keen to investigate is the Negrito diaspora. And in Malaysia, we have we've engaged the Jehai community. They have just been marvelous. Kampung Sungai Tiang in Belum. And in the Andaman Islands, there are Jarawa and Onge, which are also the Negrito peoples. And in the Philippines, we have the Mamanwa, the Agta, and so on. So we had data to compare these three groups as part of the Negrito diaspora. And here, again, it's a PCA to look at groups of people and look at how closely related they are. Here we have the Jarawa and Onge of the Andaman Islands. We have the Jakun, Seletar, and Temuan here, and then the Batik, the Kinta, and Mandrik. Sorry. These are the Melanesians and the Papuan, okay, here. And the Jakun, Seletar, and Temuan are actually segregating together with other communities in mainland Southeast Asia. Here, there is a great distinction between the Melanesian and Papuans, the Onge and Jarawa, and then we have our Negritos here, and these the rest of the population cluster there, all right? So what can we say about the Negritos? We can say that they are genetically unique and the descendants of the first modern humans out of Africa. There is evidence of gene flow from Andamanese Negritos to Malaysian Negritos, but there is no evidence of Denisovan introgression. So this is Denisovan, a group of humans that lived much earlier in the Denisovan cave. We don't see those bits of DNA in our Negritos, but we do see them in Papuans and Aborigines from Australia. We then ask the question, let's look at selection, let's look at natural selection, let's look at adaptation of these communities in the rainforest environment. And and this was done later on in 2014, a couple of years after we published that. We looked at selection of genes at certain loci that affected certain traits. So when we looked at our communities, 377 genetic locations had to do with contributions to height, how tall or short or medium height a person was. 107, quite a substantial portion, had to do with blood pressure. 56 had to do with the immune response. 32 with cardiovascular parameters. 19 with pigmentation, with melanoma, and so on. And when we looked at the details, these were the signatures of natural selection and adaptation. Firstly, there was selection to differing diets. In particular, and I've just taken a few here, they're lots more. There are these two genes, LRP2, DLC1, that are linked to nutrient uptake that are linked to obesity and also in some way connected to type 2 diabetes. The second signature was to tropical forest environments and behavioral responses, where we found that neuroregulin was selected. Neuroregulin is very important in wound healing, and KCNM1 and TTC are very important in sensory organ development. So this is where the biology now makes sense. That adult height, facial morphology, these three genes. And in the Negrito specifically, we noticed quite an interesting phenomenon, which was that they tended to have higher blood pressure than other people. So with the Negrito communities, 120/80, which is sort of taken to be the WHO standard, is really, the graph is skewed more to 130/80 or something. You know, they're skewing to a higher blood pressure, and we're still investigating why that is the case. And we know that the gene has been under selection to actually give a high blood pressure you know, possibly we can theorize about this maybe later on. So then I'm just going to move on to some work that we've done on health. And this is something that we see in Malaysia today. We still see these communities in the forest fringe, and we see the youths that have moved to the urban areas in Kuala Lumpur and so on, right? So we've got what's happening is an epidemiological transition. And I think Dr. Isandis will talk to this as well in later sessions. So this was something we published in 2015 that actually documented the prevalence of cardiometabolic risk factors by tribes and sub-tribes. So over here, these are the risk factors. Obesity and abdominal obesity are on the rise, specifically in the Seletar and the Mahmari. Hypertension, as I mentioned, the Jehai, the Batik, the Negrito community. Reduced high-density lipoprotein in the Jakun and in these Negrito communities. Elevated triglycerides, we notice in the Jehai, 29.9%, 30% in the Jakun. Impaired fasting glucose, Seletar. High HbA1c, which is a measure of glycemic control in diabetes, very obvious in the Seletar. And then you have prediabetes and also diabetes mellitus that are now happening in these communities, in contrast to what was reported previously about malnutrition and more infectious disease. We're seeing this epidemiological shift. All right, so I will stop here and give the floor to Li Fang.
Hi everyone, thanks Prof. Maude. I'll quickly share some of my work on the human microbiome and Helicobacter pylori prevalence among Orang Asli. We think of microbes as bad, disease-causing, and that we should wipe them out. But we are now learning that human health is actually very dependent on a healthy ecosystem of microbes that live in the body, known as the human microbiome. Microbes have co-evolved with the human species. In other words, without microbes, there will be no humans. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors have been exposed to a plethora of microbes from their environment. In modern society, babies are born through C-section and are usually formula-fed. This greatly reduces their early exposure to microbes. On top of that, they are exposed to antibiotics, chlorinated water, and in general, over-sanitation. And we are all exposed to high sugar and carb intake. There's a theory called the disappearing microbe theory, proposed by Dr. Martin Blazer, where he said because microbes have co-evolved with the human species, perhaps a loss of microbes may be linked to a rise in modern diseases such as childhood obesity, asthma, and allergies. We are not discounting the role modern healthcare plays in lowering infectious diseases, but perhaps the rise in diseases such as heart attack, stroke, obesity may have a microbiological explanation. So we worked with 3 different communities ranging from urban to rural. The Temuan are from Bukit Lanjan in Selangor. The Temia are from Gua Musang, and the Jehai are from Belum Rainforest. So to look at Helicobacter pylori prevalence, we chose a non-invasive stool antigen testing method. There are a total of 100 samples here because that was all the findings we had. The Jehai tested, 78% of them tested positive for H. pylori compared to 6% in the Temuan. So H. pylori is an ancient member of the microbiome. It causes gastric ulcers, but there are also studies to show that it's protective against GERD, gastroesophageal reflux diseases. Next, please. And so this is a work we published last year on the saliva microbiome, working with the Termia in Postbia in Sungai Siput. This is a peak-away plot where each dot represents a person. So this plot shows how different a person is from another, where the red big circle is a calculated mean of all the women, and the blue triangle is a calculated mean of all the men. So we saw a significant difference in the saliva microbiome of Termia men versus women. Bifidobacterium was highly elevated in Termia men. So this bacteria is usually found in dairy products like milk, cheese, and yogurt. In a further analysis, we saw that Jahai and Termia had very different gut microbiome compositions, and this is an ongoing work. So back in 2016, we saw a high prevalence of hypertension, prediabetes, and obesity among the Termia. In 2017, we saw a high prevalence of hypertension among the Jahai. When we went back in 2019, hypertension was still prevalent among the Jahai, but we were also starting to see an increase in obesity as well as some diabetes. I'll pass this on to Zume, who will share some of her work.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sune, and my research is about the exploration of nasal microbiome and olfactory genetics in Orang Asli, living in urban, rural, and forest fringe environments. The map to the left shows the location of the communities, and to the right, some pictures taken during our team's last field trip back in 2019 in the Belum rainforest. Similar to Li Fang's work, my study also focuses on microbiome, but looking into a different body side, which is the nasal cavity. My next slide shows the aims, which are to characterize the communities of microbes found in the nasal cavity. And as you can see in my next slide, it is to investigate how factors such as host genetics, gender, smoking, environmental factors, and respiratory health can affect the nasal microbiome in Orang Asli. Another focus of my study is the human olfactory receptor genes. For the nuclear genome, the ideogram to the right shows the 22 autosomal chromosomes and X and Y chromosomes, with the red triangles pointing to the loci for each olfactory receptor genes. These genes are responsible for odorant detection, and they are also the largest gene family in human genome. However, studies on olfactory receptor genes are quite limited, as olfaction is often regarded as rudimentary or has less importance compared to our other senses. We aim to elucidate the genetic variations found in olfactory receptor genes in Orang Asli, and possibly linking olfactory perceptions to particular genetic variants. Next, I would like to share my fieldwork experience here. So in the next slide, there are some pictures taken from our challenging fieldwork in Belum rainforest, where we had an 1-hour boat ride and then travel by foot in muds and tall grasses due to the low water level. So for my previous slide, these two pictures at the bottom here depict the nasal microbiome sampling by using our sponsored nasal swabs to collect swab samples from the anterior nares in the nose. In contrast to the COVID swab test, our sampling did not go deep into the nasopharyngeal region to minimize the discomfort. On the next slide shows some of my preliminary results. This is a plot of nasal microbiome spectrum for two communities, the Termuan and the Termia. Each bar represents one individual, and each color represents one bacterial phylum. Parts to the left of the red line represent the Termuans, and to the right, the Termias. The plot shows the top 10 bacterial phyla from the most abundant Actinobacteria, Firmicutes, and Proteobacteria to the less abundant phyla as listed here. Even for the same community, the differences between individuals are quite significant. This is expected as high interpersonal differences have been reported for nasal microbiome profile. Nevertheless, there is no nasal microbiome study from this region that we know of, And this is an ongoing analysis where it will be very interesting to investigate the bacteria unique to our Orang Asli communities. So that's all from our group, and we look forward to share more of our research findings in the future and hopefully contribute towards the understanding of health and genetics of Orang Asli. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much to all of the speakers who contributed to that segment. We have time, I think, just a bit for maybe one question. So if anybody would like to ask. We will also have more time for questions at the end. We're running a bit over, so maybe we'll just go ahead and move on for now, and you can save your questions for Maude and the rest of her group for the end. Okay, so next we will hear from Dr. Amanda Leah. Dr. Leah completed a PhD at Duke University and is currently a Helen Hay Whitney Foundation postdoctoral scholar at Princeton University in the United States. Amanda's work, like the work we just heard about, uses cutting-edge genomic tools to understand the extensive variation in human health across individuals. And to do so, she studies people living in a variety of environmental conditions around the world, most recently working with the Turkana people of Kenya, where she leads a large research project. So in addition to bringing an international perspective to our webinar today by discussing health and well-being of indigenous groups around the world, Amanda is joining us because she is one of the co-leaders of the Orang Asli Health and Lifeways project in collaboration with myself and our co-organizer Vivek Venkatraman, Dr. Yvonne Lim, and several other people who are joining us here today. So while her work with Orang Asli in particular is just beginning, her talk today will help outline some of the collaborative research that we envision together in Malaysia and the potential for comparative work on indigenous health around the world. So, and she will also be touching on how genomic tools can be leveraged to improve health outcomes for Orang Asli. So with that, I will let Amanda take it away.
Great, thank you, Tom. Let me share my screen. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you to the organizers for putting this all together. It's been a real pleasure to join and to hear about all the great research going on. I pre-recorded my talk because my son is getting ready in the background and he can be very loud. So I'm gonna play this and let me know if there's any issues. Let's see. Nope. Of course, I just did something terrible. Hang on, let me try again.
Amanda, if you'd like, I can also try playing it from my computer. If that would be
Okay,
cool.
is this not working?
We don't currently hear any audio.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if you can play it, that would be great, since I'm clearly not doing a great job here.
Let me try that. We'll see if it goes any better.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I've had a really great...
Yeah, I think this should work. Okay, and can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
I'm at the webinar so far. It's been wonderful to meet all of you and to hear about the exciting work that's going on in the community. My plan for this talk today was to first introduce myself. I'm Amanda. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University, and as of fall 2021, I'll be joining the faculty at Vanderbilt University. I'm a geneticist and an evolutionary biologist by training, and it's through these lenses that I study how lifestyle change influences health. I currently do this work with a transitioning pastoralist population in Kenya, the Turkana, and I'll start my talk by sharing some of the main themes that are emerging from our work there to provide a comparative perspective. Moving forward, I do plan to do work with the Orang Asli in collaboration with an interdisciplinary project spearheaded by Vivek, Tom, and Ian, who you'll be hearing from next. And I'll spend the second half of my talk outlining that work with an emphasis on how I think genomic tools can be useful for understanding health and well-being in the Orang Asli. So just to motivate us all and put us on the same page, cardiometabolic diseases are a major global problem. Here are plots showing worldwide trends in BMI over the last few decades. And we can see that BMI has remained high in high-income Western countries and is rapidly increasing in other parts of the world as countries become newly industrialized. And more relevantly, we know from the work of Maude and her colleagues that cardiometabolic disease is specifically becoming a concern for the Orang Asli as they become exposed to more urban and market integrated lifestyles. And so why is it that industrialization, market integration, and urbanization seem to go hand in hand with cardiometabolic disease?
Hey, Tom, sorry to interrupt. I
Yeah,
think
there's no
not moving forward.
Yeah,
Sorry, what's the issue?
there should be like slides actually changing.
The slide progression.
Oh,
Amanda, is this a video? Or
Yeah,
is it part of, okay.
I sent you guys a
So
video.
if the video is playing, then that's bizarre.
yeah, on my screen, I see the slides changing and everything.
Oh, you do? Okay. It's not changing for us.
Okay. Well, that is certainly unexpected.
But it's a video, so it doesn't.
Yeah. Let's see here. Okay, and so do you see it change now if I move through?
Yeah, that looks like it's working.
It is going.
Okay. I'll try to play it from where we left off. And just let me know right away if there's any problems.
And so why is it that industrialization, market integration, and urbanization seem to go hand in hand with cardiometabolic disease? Well, one theory is that human physiology is poorly equipped to deal with urban lifestyles. In particular, there's a hypothesis from the field of evolutionary medicine known as the evolutionary mismatch hypothesis, which posits that traits that evolved in response to selection pressures in the ancestral environment of a population may no longer be advantageous if the environment shifts and individuals find themselves in a novel environment. With respect to cardiometabolic disease, the idea here is that essentially all human populations evolved eating a mixed plant and meat-based diet that took considerable energy to obtain. And through evolutionary time, our genomes and our physiology adapted to this type of diet and lifestyle. However, in urban areas today, we see a very different situation where a much higher in fat and carbohydrate diet is often easily obtained through a sedentary lifestyle. And therefore, it's been proposed that people living urban, market-integrated lifestyles are experiencing a mismatch between their genomes and their environment, leading to disease. The evidence that's most commonly used to support this idea comes from health comparisons between high-income countries and small-scale subsistence-level populations who are arguably living lifestyles that are more consistent with their recent evolutionary history. For example, here's a summary of data from Eaton et al. Showing that type 2 diabetes prevalence across a number of modern-day subsistence-level groups, such as hunter-gatherers, agriculturalists, and pastoralists, is about 10-fold lower than what we see in the US. These results have been followed up on by numerous groups, and many studies now exist to show that small-scale subsistence-level populations tend to be in better cardiometabolic health relative to high-income countries. And this work has been extremely influential and seems to support the idea of evolutionary mismatch. However, I would argue that it has a few limitations. First, these health comparisons between high-income countries and subsistence-level groups confound genetic and environmental differences because the genetic backgrounds and evolutionary histories of people in high-income countries versus subsistence-level groups are usually very, very different. Second, comparing mean biomarker values between two different groups doesn't really help us to understand risk at the individual level. In other words, it doesn't give us the data we need to understand why health changes as lifestyle changes. And finally, comparing biomarkers across groups doesn't get us any closer to understanding the biological underpinnings of the variation we see. And in particular, it doesn't address the question that I'm really interested in, which is what are the molecular mechanisms that connect lifestyle change with health? And so how can we begin to address these issues? Well, we can study lifestyle effects on health within a relatively homogeneous genetic group so that we can more clearly isolate the effects of lifestyle on health. And importantly, this sort of work is only really possible right now within transitioning populations, which makes them scientifically essential, in my opinion, for understanding cardiometabolic disease. To understand risk at the individual level, we can perform integrative and long-term work within a single population. And I've been really happy to see this theme being emphasized throughout many talks during the webinar. And finally, we're in an age where it's now increasingly possible to apply genomic technologies at population scale and in field settings. And we can use these technologies to try to understand how lifestyle affects health at the molecular level. And so this is the sort of philosophy that I've been trying to apply in my work with the Turkana. And first, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that work and about the lessons that we're learning there. So to tell you about the Turkana, they're traditionally a small-scale subsistence level group from the deserts around northwest Kenya, where they've lived for at least the last several thousand years. During this time, they've remained relatively isolated, partly because this region of Kenya is a very inhospitable place to live. It's extremely arid with year-round temperatures in the 90s and very little rainfall. Consequently, a central focus of the Turkana's day is finding and retrieving water, which is usually sourced from deep boreholes dug in dry riverbeds. In addition, because this environment is so inhospitable and resource poor, the Turkana people practice nomadic pastoralism and rely on livestock for subsistence. As a result, they're extremely physically active, and they consume a diet that is very meat-centered and extremely high in protein, with about 80% of the diet coming from milk, red meat, or other animal products. And so this is what the diet and the lifestyle of the Turkana has historically looked like. But over the last few decades, things have really started to change. Infrastructure has increased in this previously remote and isolated region, partly as a result of oil discoveries in South Sudan. And therefore, many Turkana have stopped practicing subsistence level nomadic pastoralism, and they now live a more sedentary and market integrated lifestyle focused on trading items such as woven baskets, fish, or charcoal. And in addition to the emergence of this non-pastoralist class of people that still live within the relatively remote and rural Turkana region, some Turkana have begun to leave both their traditional homelands and their traditional practices entirely, and are now moving into densely populated areas in central Kenya, where they experience relatively Western-like diets and lifestyles. And so over the last 3 years, my postdoc advisor, Julian Arolz, and I, in collaboration with two Kenyan scientists, Dino Martins and Joseph Kamau, as well as a really amazing field team pictured here, have been collecting data from across this lifestyle gradient spanning these three different groups. And as of March, before COVID shut down our research, we had sampled about 2,200 people across 57 locations. In each of the sampling locations, we conduct in-depth interviews with our study participants. We ask them about their diet, about their lifestyle and subsistence strategies. We ask them about their migration history, their health history, and we also conduct interviews about early life experiences because we're interested in a life course perspective on health. We also measure 9 different biomarkers of cardiometabolic health. For example, we measure BMI, we run a lipid panel, and we measure blood pressure. And finally, we also collect biological samples. We collect a few different blood samples. We also collect serum, we collect a urine sample and a fecal sample. Yeah. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of all the different analyses that we've done on this Turkana dataset, but I just want to share some of the key results and the take-home messages. One of the first take-home messages that we're seeing is that there are very few biomarkers that differ between traditional pastoralists and people that have stopped practicing pastoralism but are still living within the relatively remote and rural Turkana region. However, we do see very strong and consistent health differences between those two groups and people that are living a fully urban lifestyle. And so here I've just plotted data for an example biomarker, waist circumference, where we can see that there's relatively similar values for the two rural groups, but much higher waist circumferences for the fully urban individuals. Another takeaway message that's emerging from our work is that there are many biomarkers that show lifestyle by sex interactions. And these interactions always go in the direction such that women seem to be more sensitive to lifestyle change than men. And again, I'm just plotting an example biomarker here, BMI, where we can see very small and subtle increases in BMI for men as lifestyle change, but much more dramatic changes for women. Another thing that we've been really interested in trying to understand in the Turkana is what are the mediating variables that connect lifestyle with health? And in particular, we've been really focused on the role of diet, and that's largely because we see such dramatic differences in diet across the three lifestyle groups that I described. So here I'm plotting the proportion of people in each of the lifestyle classes that regularly consume a given food item. And what we can see is that almost all traditional pastoralists, shown in light blue, report that they regularly consume blood, milk, and meat as expected, and consume very few carbohydrates or food additives that would be obtained from the market economy. In contrast, individuals living in urban areas, shown in green, report that they regularly consume a number of different carbohydrates and processed foods. They consume fewer animal products, and they use a lot of additives like salt and sugar in their cooking. And individuals that are in this intermediate class also show an intermediate diet phenotype. And so we've been interested in asking whether this variation in diet mediates the effects of lifestyle on health that we see. But we found that lifestyle effects on health are only partially mediated by diet. Across a number of different analyses that we've done, diet only ever explains about 20 or 25% of the variance in lifestyle effects on health. And so there's clearly a lot else going on. For example, physical activity levels are likely important. Another result that's emerging from our work is that people experience very different early life and adult environments. So here I'm plotting on the x-axis the population density that each individual in our study experienced during their year of birth, where we can see that individuals that are sampled as adults in urban areas tend to be born in areas of high population density, but there's a lot of variation within this group, as there is within people that are sampled as adults in rural areas. And when we ask whether this early life variation matters, we find that it does. We're here, I'm plotting the population density experienced by each individual in their birth year against BMI and waist circumference on the y-axis. And this is all controlling for variation in lifestyle in adulthood. So we can see that experiencing urban conditions in early life has effects on adult health above and beyond the effects of adult lifestyle, which really argues for a life course perspective on change and health. And so just to summarize some of the takeaways that we're seeing, we see that urbanization and market integration are bad for health, but a little bit seems to perhaps be tolerable. And it's only in this fully urban class of people that we start to see health effects. We see in our work that women's health is often more sensitive to lifestyle change. And I've been really interested to hear that that is potentially a theme that's emerging for the Orang Asli as well. We see that changes in diet are important, but they don't explain everything. So eating a more processed and high carbohydrate diet does lead to worse health, but it doesn't explain all of the variance in health, at least in the Turkana. And then finally, we're seeing that there is a lot of within lifetime change as economic development is happening so rapidly within people's lifetimes, and that this cumulative exposure really seems to matter, and that taking a life course perspective on health is going to be really important. And so moving forward, I'm hoping to bring what I've learned from the Turkana to studies of the Orang Asli. In particular, I'm planning to work with this new collaborative project that Vivek mentioned last week, and that Tom will speak to in more detail in a few weeks, called the Orang Asli Health and Lifeways Project. And in addition to asking whether some of the themes that I just talked about from the Turkana can be helpful for understanding health and well-being in the Orang Asli, a major focus of my future work will also be to study the molecular mechanisms that connect lifestyle change with health. And in particular, the molecular mechanisms that I'm most interested in and that I think hold a lot of promise for understanding how environmental experiences become embedded into an individual's long-term physiology are a group of mechanisms called gene regulatory mechanisms and epigenetic mechanisms. So what the heck is a gene regulatory mechanism? Well, let's go back to your introductory biology class for a minute. In each of your cells, you have genes that are encoded in DNA, and those genes get transcribed into messenger RNA, which is then translated into proteins. And those proteins then go on to perform all the essential functions in your body. Gene regulation simply refers to a class of mechanisms that are used by cells to either dial up or dial down the production of specific genes at the protein level. And if you've heard of any gene regulatory mechanisms, you've likely heard of epigenetic mechanisms, which specifically alter the rate at which DNA is transcribed into mRNA. And they're especially relevant to our discussion here because this class of mechanisms is known to be highly environmentally sensitive, including to things like diet, activity levels, and stress. So just to motivate us a little further on how these environmentally sensitive gene regulatory mechanisms might connect lifestyle with health, let's imagine that we have an individual who has a gene in their genome that is relevant to BMI. In their normal state, there are epigenetic modifications on this gene, which are these red stars that are preventing that gene from being transcribed and then translated into protein. But now let's imagine that there's some sort of environmental change for this individual, which leads to the epigenetic modifications on this gene being removed. Now this gene can be transcribed at higher rates and translated into a protein that will increase BMI for this individual, leading to changes in health. And so this class of gene regulatory mechanisms and epigenetic mechanisms are becoming increasingly appreciated as a connection between environmental variation and variation in health, especially for obesity and cardiometabolic related diseases. It's also a really exciting time to be studying these gene regulatory mechanisms because the cost of doing genomic work is plummeting dramatically. So here's a graph from the NIH showing the cost of sequencing a given amount of the human genome as a function of time. And we can see that doing genomics is just getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And this is relevant because it means that we're in an era where it's possible to study genomic mechanisms at population scale. In addition, there have been a lot of advancements over the last few years in being able to perform genomic assays and study these gene regulatory mechanisms using increasingly small amounts of genomic material and samples collected in the field, which makes them relevant and ready for studying health in transitioning populations like the Orang Asli. So what can these genomic data tell us? What could we really learn that would be helpful for understanding health and well-being? Well, these genomic data can tell us what genes in the genome are turned on or turned off by lifestyle exposures. So they can point us to the biological pathways that seem to be responding to a given change in an individual's lifestyle. They can also tell us when in life exposures actually matter. And in particular, epigenetic mechanisms are known to be sensitive to environmental variation, both in early life and in adulthood. And so studying these mechanisms can help us understand which biological processes are sensitive to exposure across the life course. Studying these gene regulatory mechanisms can also help us understand whether lifestyle-induced changes in physiology set the stage for multiple non-communicable diseases. In particular, there's a lot of emerging evidence that suggests that changes in gene regulation at inflammatory genes and inflammatory pathways might be important for making individuals susceptible to multiple non-communicable diseases, not just cardiometabolic disease. And then finally, these genomic data can help us to start to understand what makes particular individuals resilient versus susceptible to the same environmental exposure, which is a topic that I'm particularly interested in. And so I hope that by leveraging these genomic tools and by studying the molecular mechanisms that connect lifestyle with health, we can start to provide a new perspective on health and well-being for the Orang Asli. And I think it's important to emphasize that this molecular work will really benefit from being embedded in both cultural and biological perspectives, and that a major focus of the Orang Asli Health and Lifeways project and of the work that I plan to do will be to use an integrative, long-term, and multidisciplinary perspective to try to understand lifestyle effects on health. And so with that, I want to thank the Health and Genomic Project team, as well as all of the study participants and the communities that we work with, without whom none of this work would be possible. I also want to thank all of my colleagues that have contributed to the research that I talked about, as well as my funding sources, and thank you all for listening.
Okay, thank you, Amanda, for that. I believe we have time for just one question, if anybody wants to ask something to Amanda now. Okay, in that case, in the interest of time, again, we can hold questions, I guess, for both of our genetics teams until the end. All right, so continuing in that theme, up next is my colleague, Dr. Ian Wallace. Ian holds a PhD from Stony Brook University and recently transitioned from a postdoctoral position at Harvard University to now being an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. So like our last speaker, Ian is a core member of our newly developing Orang Asli Health and Lifeways project, where he brings expertise on musculoskeletal diseases, biomechanics, and the developmental origins of health. So among other things, he has previously conducted research on osteoarthritis among the Tarahumara people of Mexico. And today we'll introduce plans for extending his research on osteoarthritis and neurodegeneration to understand how these unique health issues are impacting Orang Asli in particular. So go ahead, Ian.
All right. Hey everybody! What a fun webinar this is. It's shortly after 6 a.m. here in New Mexico. This is definitely the earliest talk I've ever given. But how fun is it to think about everybody spread out all over the world? So good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Thanks, Tom, for that great introduction. And really, my talk today is going to be sort of a big picture sort of talk, and it's going to touch on some issues that were brought up by Professor Maude Phipps and as well as Amanda just now. And although this today's session is focusing on the health of the Orang Asli, I thought it actually made sense to start start this talk by mentioning health in the United States, and not health in the United States currently, but instead health in the United States over 100 years ago. So if I was here in New Mexico in 1900, what are the things that I would be scared of dying from? Well, it wouldn't be the types of diseases that people are scared of dying from today, except maybe COVID. But what people would be afraid of dying from 100 years ago or so would be things like malnutrition, and especially infectious diseases, things like tuberculosis, pneumonia, the flu, syphilis. These were the major causes of death in the United States 100 years ago. And I should say that even in this graph here on the left, it says heart disease, but that's almost entirely infectious heart disease, a type of heart disease that is pretty uncommon today. So really, malnutrition and infectious diseases were the things that you would be afraid of. But that started to change, and beginning in the late 1800s and early 1900s, due to major improvements in medicine and sanitation, life expectancy started to go up and up and up. And life expectancy now is much greater than it was in 1900. So great that we just elected a president who is 78 years old. And trust me, I'm very thankful for that the people in the United States decided to shift gears and go with President-elect Biden. But anyway, now we have a person who is a 78-year-old president-elect. So life expectancy is much greater now than in the past. Now, that of course is a good thing, but at the same time that life expectancy has gone up, the things that we get sick and die from has changed dramatically as well. So today, unlike in the past, today, what we're really afraid of getting sick and dying from are not things like malnutrition and infectious diseases, except of course COVID, but really it's chronic, non-infectious or non-communicable chronic diseases. And those are things that we've already mentioned, things like cardiometabolic dysfunction, cancer, musculoskeletal disorders, neurological degenerative disorders like Alzheimer's, things that were once pretty uncommon, but today are the leading causes of morbidity and mortality. Maude brought this term up, but I'll reiterate it again. This phenomenon is referred to generally as the epidemiological transition. Okay, so the epidemiological transition is a phenomenon that's characterized by a decline over time in morbidity and mortality due to malnutrition and infectious diseases, and at the same time a rise in non-infectious chronic diseases, things like obesity, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, arthritis, back pain, things like that. So in the United States, the epidemiological transition is more or less complete. Aside from COVID, things like malnutrition and infectious diseases are not considered major health concerns anymore. And it's really these chronic non-infectious diseases that are the biggest problems today. Of course, the epidemiological transition is ongoing in other parts of the world. And this is especially true in newly industrialized countries. So countries who have undergone major industrialization within the last few decades. And we can see this very clearly in the rise of certain chronic non-infectious diseases in specific countries. So if we look at a disease like type 2 diabetes, and we think about the prevalence of the type 2 diabetes today and the projected prevalence of type 2 diabetes 10 years from now, we can see that the fastest rising rates of type 2 diabetes in the world are in newly industrialized countries, places like Mexico, Brazil, China, and India. And again, this is just evidence that the epidemiological transition is ongoing. And of course, this includes Malaysia. Malaysia has undergone just a remarkable degree of industrialization very, very rapidly within the last 50 years or so. Truly remarkable on a global scale. And as a result of that, we have seen, or paralleling that, I should say, we have seen a rise in chronic non-infectious diseases. The ones that are probably most commonly discussed are type 2 diabetes, overweight, and obesity. And this is just a graph that I took from a recent review paper. And the data here could not be more clear. We see that since the mid-90s, there have been dramatic increases in the prevalence of these health issues related to metabolic dysregulation. And why is this? Well, it's obviously not due to some recent major genetic changes that have taken place since the 1990s. It's due to lifestyle changes. This is something that I think is pretty well accepted, right? And although the exact lifestyle changes that are most important are not completely well understood, I think in general terms, we understand what the major lifestyle changes are. And these include diet, right? Changes in diet with a shift towards more easy access to high fat, high sugar processed foods, as well as declines in physical activity. A lot of us do not have nearly as physically strenuous lifestyles as, say, our grandparents did, right? So we generally understand that diet and physical activity are both important factors, although precisely which aspects of diet and which types of physical activity are most harmful remains to be worked out. And that includes in most countries, not just Malaysia. All right, so we know that the epidemiological transition is ongoing in newly industrialized countries. What about non-industrial societies experiencing lifestyle changes? So we've heard already today from Maude Phipps about changing lifestyles among the Orang Asli. Amanda just talked about changing lifestyles among the Turkana. And it is true that within especially newly industrialized countries, but even some highly industrialized countries, there are pockets of people that until recently have lived primarily as hunter-gatherers or as subsistence farmers, right? These are the two common sort of non-industrial lifestyles, hunting and gathering and subsistence farming. And these people are undergoing major lifestyle changes. And really, wherever we look in the world, this is the case, right? Whether it's Australia or Kenya, Amanda just mentioned pastoralists. This is true of subsistence farmers as well in Kenya. Mexico, this is where I have worked for the last 5-10 years or so among subsistence farmers there. India, right? Everywhere we look in the world, all the last remaining sort of subsistence level societies are experiencing rapid lifestyle changes. There are no sort of hunter-gatherers or subsistence farmers living anymore exactly the way that hunter-gatherers lived thousands of years ago. That's just not occurring anymore, okay? Now, oh, and here's just a couple examples of some actual data on this. Here are some data from a paper that Tom Kraft published a couple years ago from a group that he's been working with in Bolivia, a group called the Chamane that he'll maybe mention more later on. But here, these are sort of forager horticulturalists. And even within the last couple decades, since 2002, you can see really dramatic increases in BMI, as well as the proportion of the population that's overweight. And interestingly, just like Amanda just mentioned, you see that especially among females. So there does seem to be this gender difference in the effects of lifestyle transition on health outcomes. Very similarly, I'll just give you some very simple data from the group that I've worked with in Mexico in recent years, the Tarahumara. If you compare data that we've collected to data from the 1970s, you see dramatic increases in body mass index as well as abdominal size, right? So these are really dramatic changes that have taken place relatively recently over a very short period of time. Okay. Now, what about the Orang Asli? Okay. So we know that the Orang Asli have been undergoing lifestyle changes. I think that many people who are not really as intimately familiar with Orang Asli as you all are, or we all are, this is sort of how people or anthropologists tend to picture the Orang Asli, these sort of stunning, beautiful pictures of Batek taken by Kirk Endicott. Of people living in the forest using blowpipes, digging up tubers. This really it could not be a more iconic view of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. But of course, we know that Orang Asli individuals have been undergoing lifestyle changes, and dramatic ones, in recent decades. This has come in a variety of forms, and different sub-ethnic groups of Orang Asli have been affected more than others, or embrace change more than others. And this has included changes in diet, access to technology, all sorts of different driving factors. And this has really been driven in large part by a number of sort of socioeconomic and cultural factors: urbanization, market integration, of course, resettlement, and plenty of other factors as well. And I have to say, of course, as sort of tipping my hat here to Colin and the heroic work that he does, that there's no doubt that some of this lifestyle change, if not the majority of it, has been influenced by violations of land rights and environmental destruction. So what can we say about non-communicable chronic diseases among the Orang Asli? And before I answer that question, I want to just sort of map out a couple of different categories of non-communicable chronic diseases. These are the diseases that are probably the most common and among the most disabling and deadly in the world right now, particularly in Western countries. Actually, probably in many different types, all countries, but the most data come from Western countries. But we have metabolic disorders, right? Obesity, heart disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, things we've talked about, things that have been talked about in talks previously. There are also major musculoskeletal disorders, things like osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, back pain. Osteoarthritis and back pain, these are the most disabling diseases in the world, right? So the majority of disability in the world is due to things like osteoarthritis and back pain. Then you have neurological disorders, neurodegeneration, dementia, Alzheimer's. And then of course, things that are not often thought about or studied very much among hunter-gatherers, but are very important in things like mental health disorders, depression, and anxiety. Okay, so what can we say about Orang Asli chronic non-infectious diseases or non-communicable diseases? Well, let's start by thinking about what we know about the past, okay? And in order to sort of get a handle on what the situation was in the past, I had a look at the most definitive text on this, written by D. Baer, who Maude Phipps mentioned earlier. This book really is an incredible resource published by COAC, and it really is a very nice, has an incredible bibliography of all of the health research that had been done in Malaysia on Orang Asli people up until about the year 2000. In 2010, D. Baer published an updated bibliography. So I went to this, and basically over the last couple of years, Tom and Vivek and I have basically gotten every paper in the bibliography of this book, and more recently, and had a look at these papers. And there really is a tremendous amount of health research that has been done in Malaysia over the years. When it comes to chronic non-infectious diseases, though, there really is not, there's really only information about metabolic disorders. So it's important to say that as far as how the prevalence of all of these things like musculoskeletal conditions, neurological disorders, mental health disorders, there really is nothing published on these types of disorders in the past. So what data we do have on Orang Asli in the past are all from metabolic disorders, about metabolic disorders. And I should say that even within that literature, there are a few caveats here. There are not that many papers from Orang Asli in the past that actually dealt with metabolic disorders. And oftentimes these papers had pretty small sample sizes, and they also were done on sick people. So some of these studies were done on patients at Gombak. And the other thing is that that very rarely are the sub-ethnic groups specified. So the Orang Asli are sort of talked about as one group, and it's very unclear sometimes what group they're talking about. So with these caveats in mind, I still think it's possible to say a couple of things about what metabolic health at least was like in the past. It's pretty fair to say that obesity was quite rare. Type 2 diabetes was quite rare, and heart disease was quite rare. And I put here hypertension was rarer, and that is just sort of to acknowledge what Maude Phipps has mentioned, and that is that that there does seem to be, especially among the Jahai and maybe Batek, a sort of predisposition for hypertension, and the idea that this hypertension is maybe related to genetics makes a bit of sense, because the hypertension among the Jahai was actually mentioned or observed even in the early 1960s, before any sort of major lifestyle changes had taken place among the Jahai. So, but it still seems that it's fair to say that hypertension may have been rarer in the past, but not completely absent. Okay, so what about today? Well, the first thing to mention about today is that I want to say that there has been incredible work done in the last 10, 20 years on metabolic disorders, and I'll get to that in a second. But I will say that there's that these other major non-communicable chronic diseases still have yet to be studied among the Orang Asli. So the first thing to sort of say about the modern the state of modern knowledge is that there's still a lot of diseases that we don't know very much about. That said, metabolic disorders we've learned quite a bit about in the last few years. There's been more papers than this published. I just bring up these 5 papers here as 5 that I think are especially informative. That have really, I think, much larger sample sizes than any sort of previous studies. Really good sample sizes where sub-ethnic groups are specified, and yeah, these are really excellent papers. I will mention, I'll get back to this in a second, that there's some pretty clear evidence that some of the patterns here are being driven by lifestyle, but we don't actually have a lot of lifestyle data actually. But I'll get to that in a second. I want to zero in on one paper that Maude actually brought up here, and it's this 2015 paper. I could really take data from any of these papers and highlight it, but I want to zero in on this 2015 paper by Maude's group, which is fantastic and really highly informative. And they looked at a number of different cardiometabolic conditions in a bunch of different groups. And one thing that was really helpful about this group is that they broke them down by what we could consider a lifestyle gradient. Okay, so they sort of compared what they called forest hunter-gatherers or to resettled communities to urbanized fringe city dwellers or city fringe dwellers. But I think it's really important to highlight that this is one of the real things that's unique about the Orang Asli in Malaysia, or Malaysia as a study site, is that you see this really interesting lifestyle gradient, right? Not all Orang Asli are living the same lifestyles. And this helps us sort of begin to identify which lifestyle factors are really important in determining some of these health outcomes. And it's pretty clear that aside from, you'll notice here among the hunter-gatherers, this really high rate of high prevalence of hypertension. But aside from hypertension, it's pretty clear that there is a gradient in health outcomes that parallels this gradient in lifestyle differences, where you see that the urbanized folks have the highest rates of obesity and high blood sugar, type 2 diabetes. Resettled communities are a bit less, and then definitely the forest hunter-gatherers seem to be at lowest risk of a lot of these different metabolic disorders. So again, sort of the take-home point of this paper that I got was that metabolic disorder risk appears to relate to lifestyle factors. But what lifestyle factors are to blame, right? So we talked about earlier that we think that diet and physical activity are both really important. But what aspects of diet are particularly important, and how important is physical activity relative to diet? And all of these things, of course, are really important to figure out if we want to help prevent these diseases from developing. Now, I certainly do not want I should just mention that one of the things we really do want to know going forward is how does urbanization influence physical activity patterns? How does resettlement influence physical activity? These things are big questions. They're easy to ask. They're very difficult to answer, right? It's not easy to measure physical activity. It's not easy to get really detailed information on diet, but going forward, to really sort of tease apart some of the patterns that Maude's group has illustrated, to really tease apart what are the underlying lifestyle factors that are most important, is going to require some really detailed data on physical activity and diet. Okay, so we need more data on physical activity and diet. And we also need more data on other types of non-communicable chronic diseases. And why is this? Well, it's important because in a lot of cases, in a lot of places in the world, musculoskeletal conditions, for example, are the #1 leading cause of disability. And yet we have completely, we have no information on that from the Orang Asli. So it's really important that we understand that. And there are also reasons to believe, I've discussed this with Colin, there are reasons to believe that mental health disorders are something that is very underappreciated and could be a major problem among Orang Asli people, especially due to some of the challenges they're facing right now. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is just to present a project that I am planning on instigating with, or initiating with other people in the coming year. And this project we call the Orang Asli Osteoarthritis Study, or the OAOA study. And we hope to start this in next year. And this is part of this larger project that you've heard mentioned before, the Orang Asli Health and Lifeways project. I want to briefly mention right now that we just received a grant from the National Institutes of Health in the United States to begin this study. So osteoarthritis, as I've mentioned, is the most prevalent joint disease among humans today, and it's the leading source of chronic pain and disability. And knees are the most commonly affected joints. And while many tissues in the joints are affected by osteoarthritis, the hallmark of the disease is really the breakdown of articular cartilage between the bones, which eventually can lead to bone-on-bone contact and really grinding away of the bones. It's a very painful disease. Now, because the prevalence of osteoarthritis increases with age, it's long been assumed that the disease is actually caused by aging, and that the high prevalence among people today is simply the result of people living longer. And implicit to this view is that as people age, their joints accumulate more wear and tear from physical activity, and that's what's driving the disease, or that's what's thought to be driving the disease. So in the common wisdom, physical activity is bad for your joints. However, recently, my colleagues and I have been thinking about osteoarthritis quite differently. So rather than being in an inevitable outcome of getting old, we believe that it might be an example of a mismatched disease. So something that Amanda was just talking about. So mismatched diseases are, defined as diseases that are prevalent today because our bodies are poorly suited to modern lifestyles and environments. And one of the first indications of this, I'll just briefly mention this study, came from a study I did a few years back where I went through all the museums in the United States and got skeletal remains of people, all the hunter-gatherers that we have skeletons for in the United States, and as well as people from the early industrial era, as well as sort of cadaveric skeletal remains of people who died just in the last few years. And what we were able to show is that among people over the age of 50, knee osteoarthritis was twice as common among people today as it was among prehistoric hunter-gatherers, as well as early industrial people. And this was even after we controlled statistically for variation in lifespan. So knee osteoarthritis is very common today, and it's not just because people are living longer. Okay, so this is one indication that this might be a mismatched disease. And this is just a figure from a review paper that my colleagues and I published a couple years ago. This is the idea basically here is what we hypothesize is that the prevalence of osteoarthritis has gone up in very recent times due to a couple of real critical risk factors. And I can talk more about this if you all have questions. I don't need to go into this in great detail, but really what we see happening is that the rise of knee osteoarthritis is really paralleling rises in obesity, chronic systemic inflammation, physical inactivity, not activity, and increases in high fat, high sugar diets. All right, so this is knee osteoarthritis is just a part of a larger trend in other diseases. Okay. As Tom mentioned, I've studied this in osteoarthritis among a population undergoing lifestyle changes in Mexico. I won't go into that right now, but I'll just mention that I have done that. I've looked at osteoarthritis in remote areas before, and the data there sort of supported our hypothesis that changing lifestyles are having a negative influence on people's joint health. All right, so the Orang Asli osteoarthritis study is really going to leverage this lifestyle gradient that Maude so nicely sort of outlined in her 2015 paper. Is that it's really good opportunity to sort of understand the influence of lifestyle changes on osteoarthritis risk and osteoarthritis prevalence, because we see a gradient of lifestyles, right? And the general hypotheses, I'll just put these out there that I have that we'll aim to test, is that people with more traditional lifestyles are expected to be less susceptible to painful, disabling knee osteoarthritis because of two things. First, we hypothesize that early in life, their knee tissues become adapted to vigorous and dynamic loading, making them more resistant to osteoarthritis later in life. And second, due to low levels of obesity, they rarely experience chronic low-grade systemic inflammation and are likewise generally less sensitive to knee osteoarthritis pain. All right. So you might be wondering, how are we going to measure this? So we recently were able to get a very mobile X-ray machine that we can bring into the rainforest and run off of a car battery. We can measure inflammation pretty easily through things like blood spots. We have a pain sensitization protocol. And we're also going to work very hard to use accelerometers to start getting good data on physical activity as well. Okay, so why is this osteoarthritis project significant? Well, knee osteoarthritis and pain have never been studied among the Orang Asli, and this is likely one of the last chances to do so among more traditional living individuals. If knee osteoarthritis risk is relatively low among traditional Orang Asli, the findings of this study have major implications for developing strategies aimed at preventing osteoarthritis in Malaysia and elsewhere. Okay, so thank you all very much for listening to my talk. I want to give special thanks to these folks here who have been really helpful in terms of encouraging me and my interest in shifting my research focus to Malaysia. I went to Malaysia a couple summers ago for the first time, and it was really a turning point in my life, and I look very forward to spending much more time there in the future. And I want to end by saying that I am definitely open to collaborating with anybody, researchers, as well as non-researchers, really anybody who is interested in osteoarthritis in particular, but the Orang Asli Health and Lifeways project more generally. We really are open to collaboration, which is why we're sharing our ideas with you today. All right, so thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Ian. If we have time for maybe a really quick question, if someone has, otherwise we can hold those to the end as we've done for some of the other talks.
We have a question that came in from Rosemary here. She says, I know that there's variation among individuals in terms of the tightness of their ligaments. Are there also variations at the population level? Ian?
That's an interesting question. And I don't know if there's well, there probably is. I mean, I'm not sure what data are on that, but I mean, certainly there are, for example, populations that have seating, the way that they sit is different than people do in chairs or something like that. So people who adopt crouching positions, oftentimes I'm guessing have different ligament laxity than people who sit in chairs all day. I don't know of good data on that. But certainly muscle strength and ligament tightness is something that could influence sort of stability of joints and risk of osteoarthritis. This is another line of data that hopefully we'll be able to collect is information on at least muscle strength. So it's a good question.
Okay, great. And with that, I would like to introduce our final speaker for today, Dr. Andy Hickson, here from Actionwork Worldwide. Dr. Hickson grew up in a Timiar village in Kelantan before going on to complete his MA in social anthropology from SOAS in London in 1997. And he also holds a PhD in education from the University of Exeter, which he received in 2010. Andy is founder and CEO of the NGO Actionwork, and his work is dedicated to using social theater to combat issues of bullying, peace, and violence. Today, he shares with us an account of how residential changes, displacement, and rapid development have affected and continue to affect Timiar living in Kelantan. Thank you, Andy.
Hello, Thomas. Hello, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to give a short layperson's account of Orang Asli life based on my own personal experience. I will start by sharing my screen. Okay, can you see that screen share okay?
Yes, it looks good.
Looks good.
Thank you. Okay, so when I was 13 years old, I started living with the Timiar Orang Asli. It was 1973. The forest was lush, it was green, it was beautiful, it was abundant. And to get to our village, we had to take a train from Kuala Lumpur to what was then a small kind of cowboy town called Guamasang in the north of Malaysia, in the state of Kelantan. Now, at that time, there were no roads leading to Guamasang. The only way you could get there was either trekking through the jungle or taking what was called the Jungle Railway. As an aside, the Jungle Railway still exists. And if anybody has an afternoon free, it's well worth still taking it from Kuala Lumpur up to Kota Baru. Now, from Guamasang, we had to then take a Land Rover or a four-wheel drive vehicle along one of the first logging roads to the interior. That was generally about 4 hours slow driving, longer if it was raining, on very sticky, wet, muddy logging roads. When we got to the end of the logging road, we had to cross a river, and then it was roughly a 3-hour gentle trek through the jungle, followed by a 30 to 40 minute boat ride, not a motorboat. We had to punt our way up the river to the village that we were staying. Total journey time from Guamasang to our village in the jungle was about 8 hours. Now, today, I can make the same journey all the way in about 30 minutes on-road that's completely tarmacked. Back in 1973, life for the Temiars was good, apart from one village near us where a number of Temiar villages suffered and died from some unexplained illness. Amongst all the other Temiar that we were with, and it was quite a large area that we had access to, and I often myself, illegally, so to speak, didn't see any at all. There was no alcohol. Alcohol addiction was non-existent. There was no alcohol. There was no sign of any drugs at all. The only drug was the gabug, the Temiar dance, trance, singing and dancing sessions, some of which would last for nights on end. Now, I was living there in the jungle with my mother, younger brother and sister, as you do. My mother was using this time to research for her PhD. Within 3 months of living there, I was able pretty much to speak the Temiar language, at least to be able to hold reasonable conversations. And very soon, all of us were adopted into the local Temiar kinship network. To the Temiar, we were told that we were regarded as honorary Temiar. Now, to this day, much of my thought processes and indeed my identity are influenced by Temiar life and culture. Just before I left the village and returned back to the UK, one of the elders from a neighbouring village, Lambok, a guy called Pengulu Dalam, who was also known by Jeffrey Benjamin, and he mentioned him in his excellent talk last week. He took me to one side and he presented to me his prize blowpipe. And he said, very simply, never forget the Temiar. That sentence has stayed with me my whole life, and never have I forgotten the Temiar. But it is a fear that remains with many Temiars and many Orang Asli people, that their cultures, their languages and their ways of life will soon be forgotten. We're all witness to this slow erosion through deforestation, displacement, and the variety of styles of education. In the 47 years since my first visit till now, I have witnessed the almost total destruction, and I don't think I'm being extreme here, of not only the Malaysian rainforest, but the Temiar and other Orang Asli way of life. It started with the logging, which continues today. Then came the palm oil plantations, and now we see the addition of huge durian plantations. Rain, forest destruction, the introduction of monocultures, and the loss of diversity. In my opinion, there has been no regard for where the Temiars or other Orang Asli live. If the authorities or corporations want the land, then the Orang Asli are displaced. No discussion and no compromise. It is literally their way or the highway. My first stay with the Temiars was from 1973 to 1975. When we returned to the UK in 1975, all of the residents of our Temiar village that we'd stayed with from 1973 were moved to different locations. And their village, what was our village, was then given to a group of Malay residents. Some of the Temiars were moved to sort of government-style reservations, and others decided to try and create their own village as close as possible to some of their ancestral lands. Now, just looking at these pictures, you can see the transformations that have taken place, and these transformations have taken place in front of my own eyes. The top three pictures are all in and around Temiar ancestral lands. The bottom three pictures show some of the destruction of these lands. So, as I was saying, the Temiar villages were all displaced from their homes and relocated elsewhere. Some went to places allocated to them by the authorities, and others tried to make a new start on their own. Several of these Temiar moved to a location close to what was a small road, now turned highway. They found this preferable to where the authorities had tried to move them to. Here, they live on the edge. Cars, trucks, and lorries rumble past day and night. The forest around them is slowly shrinking as the oil palms get closer and closer. The Temiars living here seem to show feelings of disorientation, hearing the constant flow of traffic. They appear to be very depressed, and they are kind of switch off to life. They've lost their energy, they've lost their spirit. It is a far cry to the energized, creative people that I lived with in the 1970s. Currently, they've expressed to me themselves that they feel nothing can be done to stop the onslaught that is facing them. Now, interestingly, the one, if I can take out something positive, the one positive sign in this motorway, this highway village, is the lack of alcohol and the lack of alcohol addiction. And that is unlike many other dislocated Temiar communities. In the motorway community, the villagers receive regular intimidating visits from plantation representatives trying to move them off this small plot. They also face continuing pressure from the authorities, trying to find ways to justify their existence there. They are crying out for help and assistance. And how long they will be able to hold out, I don't know. They don't know. The change is fast. One day I can see beautiful forests and rivers, and the next I'm witnessing abandoned equipment and large oil processing machines in once was lush, clean jungle. When I lived with the Temiar, I could drink straight from the river with no health repercussions. I did this every day for nearly 2 years. It's not possible now. Even swimming in some of the rivers is considered a health risk now. The Temiars are known to be amongst the most peaceful people in the world. This peaceful nature, I believe, has been taken advantage of by the authorities, by corporation representatives and the legal system. Even some people who they believed were helping them have scammed them, and some in extreme ways. Despite this, they've continued to represent themselves in peaceful ways through demonstrations and blockades, through the courts, through engaging with politicians and the political process, through the multiple use of social media and shouting out on Facebook and Instagram, and Twitter, and so on. They have had very few minor victories. Most of these have been in delaying further destruction of their ancestral lands. But most of the time, most of the promises that have been given to them have been empty. The destruction continues, unabated. Short-term profits for the few count for everything. Now, just as a little bit of light relief, I'd like to recite a short poem by Cicely Herbert, which was written in 1939. It's called Everything Changes. Everything changes. We plant trees for those born later. But what's happened has happened, and poisons poured into the seas cannot be drained out again. What's happened has happened. Poisons poured into the seas cannot be drained out again, but everything changes. We plant trees for those born later. Bear in mind that was written in 1939. The future of the Temyar and other Orang Asli in Malaysia, in my opinion, is unclear. The current path of ignorance and destruction is leading to severe mental health problems. There's a loss of Temyar identity, loss of Temyar culture, loss of Temyar language and belief system. There's the elimination of them as the guardians of our forests, of the ecosystems of this planet and of the diversity in our forests. There's an increase in disease, there's an increase in pandemics, there's a rise in global warming. Now, I believe that the health of the Orang Asli in Malaysia is a barometer for all of us. They lose their ancestral lands, we lose our forests. They lose their homes, we lose the guardians of the forests. They lose their livelihoods, we lose our planet. Many people say that the Orang Asli need help, need our help. But the truth is that we need their help. Yeah, without them, ultimately, it's going to be the end of our planet as we know it. And I don't believe that's an extreme point of view. Once the forests are gone, they will be gone, and we will soon follow. We ignore their plight at our peril. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Temyar have had a huge influence on my life. This has both had an effect on my personal and my professional life. In my professional life as a playwright, I've always included references to the Temyar, some more obscure than others. And as an end to my session, I'm going to read you a short extract from one of my plays that I've included. It's a story that I made up called Taju Relai. Once upon a time, there lived this huge snake. Her name was Taju Relai. She lived high up on the mountain within one of the lush forests of West Malaysia. Now, Taju Relai lived many, many years ago. There were very few people in Malaysia then, just beautiful, lively forests, crystal clear waters, and fine, fine days. There were so many species of animal that you'd spend the rest of your life naming them. It was a fantastic place. And Taju Relai lived in harmony with it all. One day, as Taju Relai lay stretched out on one of the topmost branches of a tree, soaking up the sun, a strange man came up to her and said, "I want that tree." So she moved to the adjacent tree. "I want that tree too," he said. So she moved to the next one along. "Look, just clear off, snake," he said. "I'm having all of these trees around here." Now, Taju Relai was quite upset. This was no way to behave. Why did this strange ghost-like man have to be so greedy? Couldn't he use a tree that was unoccupied? There were plenty of trees, more than enough for everybody. So Tajuralai went off in search of a tree. On the way, she met Arak, Abilam, and Tenga. They were members of the Golden People who lived in the forest and who shared all of the joy around them with anyone who crossed their path. Now, the Golden People, or the Temiars, were black. And when the sun clipped any part of their skin, it would send off a shimmering golden particles, a gold so deep it held within it all the colors of the rainbow. "Where are you going?" said Tenga. "I'm trying to find a tree," Tajuralai replied, "one that is far, far away from the ghost man." Arak then whispered the following riddle into Tajuralai's ear: "To domineer, to slaughter, or to fear, whichever way you go is forwards, and all holes will be filled, Tajuralai, my friend." Now, Tajuralai thought for a minute. She always took what Arak said very, very seriously. I mean, amongst other things, Arak was a great healer, a seer. She could see things that others could only look at. "Thank you, my friends," Tajuralai finally said. "If you are looking for some food, I saw some lovely fruit on that large gabag tree." And with that, she slipped further off into the forest to look for that one special tree away from the ghost man. She combed the forest for 5 hours, and eventually she came to a little brook. Next to the brook was a flowering chebchib tree. It had space all around it. She stretched high above the canopy. Tajuralai slipped up the trunk. Right to the top she went, taking in the scent of the beautiful lilac flowers. The sun shone wonderfully on her back. Tajuralai slept for 25,000 years, give or take a day. How could she sleep for so long? It was the path she chose to take. The shock of hitting the ground is what woke her. She opened her eyes. Next to her laid a tree chopped down. There was no brook, there was no gold, just a dull grayness and the ghost man. That was the last thing she ever saw, for the hole she was now lying in was steadily filling up with concrete. No one ever heard her last words. Thank you for listening. That's where I'm going to end it. Not your most traditional presentation, but I hope you got something out of it. In any case, I, along with the other presenters, of course, will be happy to answer any questions, if any, should come my way. I will now pass back to Vivek and the panel. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Andy, for that insightful talk. We're going to go ahead and, as Andy said, open it up to discussion now. There's a few questions that have been popping around in the chat box. I'd like to lead with one of those that came from Chila Dallos. I believe it was directed towards Ian's talk, wondering about how if and how the relationship and possible effects of psychological stress or lack thereof might affect the inflammation or osteoarthritis figures in your research on osteoarthritis.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a really interesting question. So there's really good evidence that really sustained chronic psychosocial stress can lead to chronic low-grade systemic inflammation. So you can have, prolonged psychosocial stress can lead to inflammation. Now, so how inflammation relates to osteoarthritis is actually pretty interesting. So one thing that is interesting about osteoarthritis is that there is not a very close connection between structural damage that's done to joint tissues and pain. And by that, I mean that there's a lot of people out there that are probably experiencing cartilage deterioration, but they're just not in pain. And so it's an underdiagnosed disease. And it's really only until you get that pain that is that you start to care about the having osteoarthritis. So what causes pain? Well, it's it's becoming very clear that it's inflammation. So inflammation plus tissue damage is when you get the pain. Now, what can lead to inflammation then becomes sort of the most interesting thing. So we do know that having excess adiposity or fat tissue can lead to chronic low-grade inflammation, as well as psychosocial stress. So you can imagine a situation where the Orang Asli have maybe for a long time been just as susceptible to knee osteoarthritis or tissue damage for the last 50 years. But it's only recently that the pain has started to impact their lives due to the rise in inflammation. So it's not like they were ever unsusceptible to osteoarthritis. It's just that certain lifestyle factors, psychosocial stress, different changes in diet, whatever, are now just bringing to light the painful aspects of this disease. So it's fascinating, and also potentially very tragic. We just don't know. But yeah, certainly psychosocial stress is one thing that we want to look at. It's not an easy thing to study. It's not an easy thing to study quantitatively, but yeah.
Right. May I say something? Mm-hmm. It's just, I can also imagine the reverse effect. Like we know that close social relationships reduce psychological stress. So the Orang Asli still have these very warm social relationships with very stable relationships over time. And so I was wondering if in fact this can act against inflammation in a sense, because it reduces psychological stress. And whether
I love that hypothesis. I absolutely love that hypothesis, and I would love to look to try to get some data. I mean, mm-hmm. that's a great idea. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Thank you. It was very interesting.
Yeah. I will just mention, Sheila, there is some evidence of that elsewhere emerging, people studying the effects of social relationships. And that's one of the hallmarks sort of these integrative projects, is that we're hoping to, with our sort of interdisciplinary team, people investigating these different aspects simultaneously. This also dovetails nicely with the talk that Andy just gave regarding the effects of psychosocial stress, obviously. And we had a question come in from Kirk Endicott in the chat box, I think most likely directed towards Andy, asking whether the problems that the Temiar face are different between those living in Kelantan and the state of Perak. Andy, would you like to speak to that?
Well, thank you, Kirk, and hello. Most of my time with the Temiar has been spent in Kelantan. Really, apart from when I've driven through the sort of the Cameron Highlands via Ipoh and seen and visited occasionally one or two Temiar villages and semi-villages there. The only other Temiar that I know in Perak have actually moved from Kelantan, mainly because of work purposes. They experience pretty much, from my experience, and this is talking really from the perspective of kind of migrating Temiar, if you like. They used to live in Kelantan, but they had to go to Ipoh for work. The ones that remain in Kelantan seem to be suffering the effects of mental health problems more acutely than those that move to the city, because maybe they've chosen to move to the city anyway, so they haven't had the same desire, if you like, to want to be near their ancestral lands that they were in. So yeah, it's difficult for me to answer, Kirk, because of my limited information.
And Andy, when you talk about mental health problems, are you mainly talking about depression, exhibiting symptoms of depression?
Mental health problems are are central to, in my understanding, I mean, Jeffrey might be able to say something here, but certainly in my understanding of much of Temiar culture is that Temiar take depression much more seriously than we did in the West. I appreciated the sort of the fact that depression is a life-threatening illness through my relationships with the Temiar much more than I learned about them my life in the UK, because in the UK it's not really until recently that mental health problems have been taken as seriously, but through various practices, mainly resulting in sharing, they, and this sort of dealing with desire, they used to not really suffer depression. At least they took it seriously. So if somebody was, they really desired something, and if they weren't going to get it, then they would suffer depression. I'm not sure whether it was Jeffrey actually on one of your papers actually talked about somebody dying from Punan radio back in the day because she desired that her husband get her a radio. It might even be in one of your papers, Kirk, I don't know. But her husband was unable to provide it, and she died, and they put it down to her death down to the fact that she hadn't got the radio. So, mental health problems certainly did exist. They're not something new, and it's certainly something that the Temiar have taken and do take very seriously. Now, through the lack of control, if you like, over their own lives, they don't have the same healing practices or access to the same healing practices, the shaman, the medicinal herbs of just the forest itself, which has its own healing properties. But they, particularly this village I talked about that live on the edge of the highway, it is a sense of depression, but it is more than that, Kirk. It feels like their life force is just slowly being sucked out of them. It's very, very, very difficult. I'm only talking from a layperson's point of view. I haven't done any research in that area. I'm only talking from what I've witnessed, from talking to my Temiar friends and what they've expressed to me.
Can I say something about this? I don't think the Pohnan radio stories from me, but you are quite correct in general terms, and as I'm sure you did too. I very early on learnt if someone wants something from you, you better not refuse it. It does lead to a very bad situation. Of course, most Temiars can probably judge when it's safe to ask for something, in the sense that they're likely to get it, but some of them maybe misjudged it. I certainly had one case of a Temiar friend who was visiting, came to Singapore, who really was highly depressed, and we actually took her to a doctor in Johor Bahru. Seems to be better now. There are all kinds of explanations as to why she was depressed, but she recognized it, and so did her family. So yes, it certainly occurs. There's a lot of variation, of course. Some people, like anywhere else, I guess, some Temiars are quieter than others, some are more noisy. But there is this general concern, which I put down to I've called a sort of dialectical framework of interaction, in which your Temiars, most of them at least, are constantly aware of what they do affects others and then feeds back onto them and so on. It's the actual relationship between them. There's no question, there are no such things as sovereign individuals, to use a current movement that is emerging in some parts of the world. Not like that at all. No one is sovereign in that sense. So yeah, you have to be aware of others' feelings. I've noticed in the recent pop songs, as you probably know, there are a few Temia pop music groups, and I've been working on the words of some of their songs with some of them. In fact, they do, in fact, very often, like love songs in the West, but they're very much texts about feelings and how people are hurt and so on that just seem to be still some sort of concern. Oh, and Kirk's question about Kelantan versus Perak, the Tamias of Perak have a considerably different history, I think. They've been in contact with outsiders for quite a long time. They were using elephants and so on in many places. They had quite close contacts with the Malay hierarchy there. They were rather more slave-raided than the ones in Kelantan. Tamias of Kelantan are pretty isolated until quite recently. And by recently, I mean probably to the 1940s. They did, in Kelantan, they did have some struggles with Malays, so much for it very frequently being saying Tamias are peaceful, but they did, in fact, in Kelantan, they are known to have attacked Malay villages if Malays encroached on their land, especially on the lower Nangiri River and so on. So, of course, it's a segmentary society. What goes for one place doesn't necessarily go for another. So there is a rather different feel, if you like, I think, amongst the Tamias of Kelantan and of Perak. Of course, nowadays they've got major roads, as you pointed out, going between the two areas. So they see a lot of each other.
Can I just sort of speak a minute to that idea of diversity amongst the different groups? Because we keep talking about sub-tribes or whatever, or the Semai or whatever. And when I was living with Semai in 1968, there was a considerable diversity in lifestyles, going from way over on the Perak side to Batu Barangkai, which was called there, to Machag, was like 10 minutes walk from Kampar City. You could walk into town and buy food. Whereas you went up back on the other side of the main range and folks were, you know, they'd obviously been influenced a lot, but still were living pretty much in the woods. So I wonder if that can be taken into account as you do these lifestyle things where you had a long history of some of these populations, these local communities, having very different kinds of, and folks on, you know, Perak side have been sedentary for a long, long time. So if that could be worked into some of your protocols. The other thing I want to say, because I was also interested in genetic microdifferentiation that time, and I keep seeing genomic studies characterizing ethnic groups or whatever they are as if these are unified populations, all homogeneous, and you have a sample of maybe 50. That's pretty good, I guess, in these days. But you know, I mean, I looked at 600 Semai and they were genetically microdifferentiated. And I wonder how much that applies to the genomic stuff as well. So there's that.
Well, Gerard Diffloff counted some 40 distinct dialects in Semai, which I think backs up what you just said.
Yeah. I went from one side to the other. I tell you, it was really different.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Thanks for that perspective, Alan, and glad that you're here. Maybe we can move on in a moment to talking about genetics in more depth. I have a question as well, but just to wrap up on the theme of the TEMIAR and the mental health, we have Justine in the comment section who says, I'm a clinical psychologist, have been working on a project examining adversity-related narratives among TEMIAR, and I think she wants to comment. So Justine, if you want to turn your camera on and speak to us, that'd be great.
Hi everyone. Hi, I wanted to comment on one of the questions about the relationship between psychological factors with osteoporosis inflammation. I really like what Ian shared about how the pain experience in itself can be enhanced by psychosocial factors. And that sort of ties in as well to the follow-up discussion about depression and mental health related problems among this community. In my work, I've realized that many of the interviewees that I interviewed, they link mental health related concerns with pain. They don't really identify their mood as depression, so they don't tell me outright, hey, Justine, I'm depressed. But they'll say, I don't feel well, I have no energy to go out. But medically, there wouldn't be anything wrong in specifics. So what I realized is that there is a lot of community out there, the Orang Asli, when they are down, there is that strong relationship between the mood and their mental health with pain or an experience of pain, somatic symptoms, if you would. That's one. And also in terms of overall, I do realize that overall there is that, if they feel unhappy, they tend to report pain quite a bit more. And they definitely attribute their mood many times to the pain that they experience. So that's what we've noticed in our time there.
Thank you very much, Justine. That's very useful context for discussion. I think, like Vivek said, we might switch gears now. We've had a bunch of questions, so I'm going to try and put one forward that came in much earlier from Maude Phipps, directed towards Juliana Azian, who is here with us. The question is about how the organization SUHAKAM, the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, how that organization is committed to aiding Orang Aslis and if there is any specific government commitment. Juliana, would you be able to unmute yourself and comment? Perhaps Juliana is not with us. I can't see exactly. Okay, and that we can return to that question later. Juliana, feel free to chime in if you return. Another question that recently came in, so returning to the theme of genetics, is one from Ian for Dr. Phipps, asking why gene variants that might increase the risk of hypertension would be under the influence of positive natural selection at all.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, for the question. And this is the sort of, $64 million question or something that we're still trying to investigate. Now, when I presented some of this work at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany last year during my sabbatical, there were some suggestions, we were just wondering whether or not having a heightened sense of preparedness that may be beneficial in a rainforest environment, given the canopy, given the tigers in there, given the wildlife in there, and whether or not that could contribute to certain communities having an increased level of hypertension, which may be beneficial for preparedness to escape this fright. We don't know, but this has been one of the ideas that some of us were talking about. So it's still something that we're going to investigate. Hopefully we will have some time. Hopefully when COVID is over, we will need to go back and revisit and tease out some of these ideas about hypertension. And I'm doing this together with Professor Khalid Kadir. You mentioned some of his earlier papers. BAK Khalid is Khalid Kadir, who is now Professor of Clinical Medicine with us. So there could be various reasons, and we're just exploring as to what could be a possibility. It's very difficult to unequivocally say that it's this or that. At the moment, what we have are several types of hypotheses as to why this might be beneficial. So if it's positively selected, it indicates to us that this is a beneficial variant to have among the Negrito community. So, your guess is as good as mine at this point, but it'd be interesting to take this conversation forward later on when we investigate. And I think in response to Alan's question as well, why are we just doing some simplification. And you're quite right, Alan, it is a simplification. If we look at it, I mean, there are how many billion of us on the planet, and each of us are individuals in our own right. So there is the genetic and the environment factor that actually gives the phenotype. But if we wanted to look at migrations, we wanted to look at certain models, we would have to have some sort of grouping of people. And this is what the genetics allows us to do. So it's by no means something that I mean, all the different dots are actually different people, but they do seem to cluster together that actually indicate a shared group of genes that they have, a shared group of variants that they have among these communities. So yes, it's somewhat simplistic, but there's a lot of bioinformatics analysis that goes to it. And we're talking about shared variants. We are yet to explore some of these medically related variants that might be quite unique, and that's a different area of genetics altogether. So I do get your point about the critique about oversimplification, but that's how we approach it from this particular perspective, this particular angle, and there are many angles to the whole story.
And maybe actually we can bring Amanda into this for a second, because Amanda, you've presented some health data from an arid living population in the Turkana Basin. Ian's question kind of revolves around possible mismatches from living in a rainforest environment, kind of the opposite. Do you have any sense or sort of predictions from your work about how things might work in that kind of ecological context?
Yeah, I was really interested, especially to hear about the selection on genes related to hypertension, because we actually in the Turkana see that while blood pressure changes as people become more urban and it increases, that there's actually sort of borderline high blood pressure among a lot of the Turkana, and we were initially sort of puzzling over this, but that we have a colleague who's studying the Dasanak, which is another pastoralist population also in East Africa living in a dry desert region, and they also see sort of higher than expected blood pressure among that population. And so I'm actually just sort of now starting to think about whether maybe what we think of as the sort of normal references from Western populations or from other sorts of populations might not really apply in the same way to other groups, given that they have different ecologies and different lifestyles and different evolved physiologies because of where they've been living, for a very long time. So that wasn't really an answer, more of a speculation, but just sort of something that we're seeing that that I was really interested to sort of hear and think about, given Maude's work.
Could I come in with one of the genetic issues? I think Lisa May is still there, though I can't see her video. She talked about the possibility that Northern Aslians had some distinctive genomic features concerned with olfaction. I don't know whether you're aware, but there is in fact quite significant linguistic literature specifically on Northern Aslian, because they have a very elaborated and differentiated lexical semantic array of words and ideas about olfaction, which I think are not shared by other Aslian groups. It's a pity. Nicole Krusper was here earlier, but she doesn't seem to be here now. She's one of the team that worked on this. So the linguists who are working on that, in fact, have raised the question, I think without necessarily providing an answer, whether there was any correlated physiological connection with this. Is it conceivable to say that Northern Aslian speakers, like specifically the Jahais, do they smell better, more differentiatedly than the rest of us? Or is it simply that having the vocabulary and for various cultural reasons being concerned with smells and odors? So it would be interesting to know if that can be connected. I think Samay said something, did you not, about some of these genes for olfaction actually being significantly functional?
Yeah, I can answer to that. Actually, the paper by Asiva Majid and Puranhal if I pronounce it correctly, are actually one of the inspiration for our study.
Oh,
So
okay.
they actually explain that the Jahai hunter-gatherers are better at naming odorants. So, and then they discuss the possibilities of genetics underlying that. And then when we look at the genetic perspective, we have a huge panel of olfactory receptor genes. Half of them are actually pseudogenes, meaning they are non-protein coding, and we do not know their functions as of now. And then for the rest of around 380, around 400 functional genes, the functions are still not very clearly elucidated. So yeah, we are at early stage, but we are very excited to see how our research can take us in elucidating the olfactions of Orang Asli.
Would it make sense to say that those particular genes are more concentrated in the hunter-gatherer and or Northern Aslian populations than in the other Orang Asli populations, or indeed the rest of the world?
Yes, I would say maybe there are some variants that are specific in these populations that are not found or maybe lost in other populations. So yeah, we will look into that aspect.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is part of Zumei's PhD project. A parallel study she's doing is actually collaborating with some of our co-investigators, one of whom is a ENT specialist, also a rhinologist, as well as an ENT surgeon. So she's going to actually, once we are able to continue our field work when COVID-19 abates, she's actually going to go back to these communities to do olfactory testing as well. Which we don't have data yet, so it's that bit is not something that she hasn't started yet, but hopefully we'll be able to start that as well. So we have something a bit more comprehensive to say about the situation. We'll see what happens. It's exciting as an area, and also you well know that olfaction is also in the animal kingdom. And this is informed by a text a long time ago called The Scented Ape, that olfaction has to do with reproductive ability as well, and reproduction. So it's the plethora of genes that are devoted to olfaction. Before we started, we had no idea that there were so many, but the minute she started looking for them, it was just tremendous to have so many pseudogenes as well as genes that are entirely related to olfactory receptors. So it's an area that she will be able to take on. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I think another question that came in that hasn't been addressed yet sort of ties a lot of these things together. So this is a question from May, who notes that many of our speakers today highlighted evidence of increasing BMI, cardiometabolic risk factors for cardiovascular disease and things like that. And her question is about whether anything is actually being done in those communities to combat these trends. And I would just sort of personally add to this question, in a broader sense, the question of how we take some of this knowledge, for example, about increased genetic risk factors, rapid lifestyle changes, rapid development, things like that, that Andy highlighted in his talk, how we can actually turn some of these observations into practice for improving Orang Asli health going forward, how we can really apply that knowledge. So this is really a question that's open to anyone who has a perspective on that.
Yeah, so Tom, I actually responded to May personally about this. So as a follow-up, I mean, it's good to find out things, but then what do you do about it, right? So we've actually embarked onto intervention studies, and in collaboration with the National Diabetes Institute, because the majority of the clinicians that are in our school are the cardiometabolic people who are very interested. So in collaboration with the National Diabetes Institute, the various universities, JACOA and the Ministry of Health, and funded by the World Diabetes Federation, we have actually started a health intervention study in 5 Orang Asli villages. And this study started in 2016, and it will come to an end at the end of this year, maybe extended a little bit because of COVID. to actually train 2 Orang Asli health interveners per village to work with their communities to do simple things like BMI measurements, blood sugar levels, and things like that. So we've already started this, and hopefully when this is over, we'll be able to look at whether or not these interventions have resulted in any positive change or no change, or it's even worse. So this is already ongoing as a pilot in 5 villages throughout Malaysia. So hopefully I will be able to share those results early 2021 when we've completed that investigation.
Okay.
And there might be other groups doing this as well. I'm not sure. So that's certainly one of the follow-ups that we are doing. And Professor Khalid Kadir is actually starting some of these studies. In fact, he's already done that on vitamin E supplements, on whether or not they make a difference in terms of the health, in terms of the triglyceride levels and things like that. So there's active research going on in that area, which is ongoing as well.
Yes, fantastic. I'll also just point out that in our last session, we'll hear from some folks who are working on sort of the applied medicine side. So now that some of these issues have been identified, for specifically these issues of chronic non-communicable diseases, folks like Dr. Izandis and Dr. Stephen Chow, who we'll hear from, both of them are involved in active efforts to sort of take that knowledge and apply it in a medical format to Orang Asli around the country.
Indeed.
Does anyone else want to share perspectives? May, you might. Well, you're speaking in our next our next session, and I know that your talk is going to cover some of this. But if you wanted to give a prelude to some of your thoughts on how these things can be applied in practice, I know you work in that realm.
Yeah. Well, just based on my observation at Kolako, so I've been getting to know people at Kolako since mid-2018. And there's a medical porter who's paid by the Ministry of Health who's appointed, but half the time he's not in the village because he's still moving around. He still moves into the forest occasionally to work. Yeah. So I don't know if the 5 communities does it include any hunter-gatherer communities, because I think whatever interventions that's designed has to be very specific, and for hunter-gatherers it would be completely different. And I honestly don't ask them what they feel should be done. Quite bad. Hello? Hello?
It's breaking up a little bit. I think the connection is maybe a bit unstable.
Yeah, sorry, I'm in Kanye, Terengganu.
Okay.
We could hear part of what you were saying. Maybe you could try one more time repeating that last part, and if we have troubles, we can return to this next week during your talk.
Okay, I'll try to go somewhere with better connection. But I guess my point was that whatever health interventions designed for a semi-settled community would be quite different to one that is still mobile, and now you see them, now you don't. So something very different has to be done. And also just want to add something about BMIs and all that. So a lot of people in Kuala Lumpur are actually quite fit. The men, they're all very muscular, right? And I just thought, okay, maybe it's a side effect of them working in the forest. Until one day I was in the village, and this little boy of about 4 years old is like, me. So he wanted to show me something. And then he proceeded to do this and show me his tiny little bicep, and he's 4 years old and he's really proud of his little bicep. So I'm like, so I thought, okay, maybe it's something in the community, maybe the men are proud of how they look, and that could be something to work with, say, if you're designing a health intervention, because diet-wise, it's not great, and they're still malnourished and all that. Yeah, but there is an interest in well, in this case, maybe the physical appearance. Yeah, so that could be something to work with in the community.
Yeah, and
we also had a raised hand earlier by Isabella.
Okay.
Isabella, do you want to turn on your video and ask a question or share a comment?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the presentations. I have a question for Amanda, actually. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, yeah, okay. I really like what you did with your research, and I was wondering, you mentioned about your upcoming research in Orang Asli being, it will be like a long-term health research, right? Would you mind elaborating on that? I mean, what do you mean by long-term? Because as far as I know, with genetics data, you usually just collect once and you analyze that. But in your case, are you going to, like follow the individuals and do frequent data collection or anything different? And how is it going to be different or like similar with your work in Turkana?
Yeah, those are great questions. I absolutely think that the sort of more life course longitudinal approach is what I'm the most interested in, and what I think is going to be the most beneficial both to research and to the communities that we're working with. So the work that I talked about will be in the context of this larger collaborative study with Vivek and Tom and Ian, and we hope for this to be a study that goes on, for the rest of our research lives, and that will, incorporate a lot of interdisciplinary approaches, not just genetics. And for the specific type of genetic work that I'm really interested in, I am interested in how the regulation of the genome changes over time. So this is something that is really dynamic across the life course. I'm not just interested in what does a given individual's genome look like, which you're right, if that's what we're interested in, we only need one sample, and collecting many samples and setting this process over time doesn't tell us additional information. But the way that genes are regulated does change a lot over the life course, depending on what's going on in the environment and how people's health is changing. And so I'm really interested in looking at that process with as much sort of time course and dense sampling as possible, because I think that's how we're really going to understand how different exposures across the life course influence health and the genome.
Would you also include the children, or are you going to focus on the adults only?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think that given that we know that physiology and gene regulation and health changes a lot over the life course, and the early life experiences are really important, I would love to include a wide variety of ages. I think the question in my mind, given that I don't have experience right now working with these communities, is whether that is something that people would be open to. So from a scientific perspective, yes, I think that would be really interesting to do. And so I'll sort of see going forward whether that is something that seems possible and that people are interested in participating on.
Okay, thank you.
If I could just kind of wrap up with one question, and this is for the geneticists here, and I guess particularly Maude, given that you're working in Malaysia, just about genetics in general and public understanding of genetics. What are some common issues or problems that we see among the general public's understanding of genetics with respect to the Orang Asli in Malaysia, and what can we be doing as scholars to help rectify any of these misunderstandings?
Right, thanks, Vivek. I actually think that there are two things that I guess people would think about in terms of genetics. One is the genetics that informs the demographics of the community, and the other one would be health related. So I think the public generally is more attuned to health-related issues because that's in the newspapers, that's to do with the lifestyle, that's to do with health advisories. People read about BRCA, BRCA1, BRCA2, genetics of breast cancer. So I think the public is a little bit more skewed towards genetics and health. And in that sense, I don't think they're very aware of what's happening on the genetics of Orang Asli health per se. I could be wrong, but I think that's the impression I'm getting. But when it comes to the narrative of the peopling of Malaysia, the peopling of, over time, I think that Malaysia as a country, and this is politically charged actually, and I think that we have been able to at least give some knowledge through scholarship about Orang Aslis being here first. I think that's really important because the narrative have been over the years, and people are very aware here that the Orang Aslis have been looked down upon. They have been called very derogatory names such as Sakai, which is extremely derogatory, and so on and so forth. And people in the urban areas, the majority of the population, I mean, there's only about 0.5% of Orang Asli, or even a little bit more today. The majority of the population who are unaware, and we're trying to build awareness of late, would tend to really disregard them. But I think one of the most rewarding things that our work has done to some extent is state equivocally that these are our indigenous communities who have been here all along, and stretching that to the past, the recent 10 to 30,000 years ago is a very powerful narrative, and it makes people think, hang on a minute, let's not propagate this only certain races are here first and everybody else were foreigners or pendatang, people who were immigrants, because at the end of the day, all of us are immigrants. So in that sense, I think we are making some leeway in terms of explaining this. But of course, there will be people who just want to push political cards and they want to bury their heads in the sand and not bother about it. But I think the narrative is there about the first peoples of Peninsular Malaysia, and they should be accorded that respect as the first peoples of Peninsular Malaysia. That's, well, anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Maude. So I just want to point out we're sort of at the end, we're a little bit beyond sort of the end of our normal time here. I did want to just build quickly on the point that Maude just made. We've had several outstanding questions that haven't been addressed in the comment section that relate to issues around land rights, which connects to this idea that Maude is talking about, the notion of, the peninsula being sort of populated by people, who's first, those kind of questions, all extending to today in terms of who actually has rights to the land that they live on. I want to just push that discussion back a little bit to next week, because we're going to hear specifically from Colin Nicholas about, I know he's going to speak about land rights, and we'll hear from some others as well dealing with those issues, so that hopefully we'll get a bit more perspective on that. And of course, also related to what Andy said today about these displaced communities in Kelantan. So with that, I do just want to say thank you again to all of our speakers today, as well as all of you for the discussion. It's really great to have everybody here, and it's nice to see a connection between these perspectives, how the sort of cultural, historical perspectives, how they dovetail with the biological, which is what we're getting into now, and we'll get into more in the weeks to come. So thank you again to everyone. This will be posted online, the transcript as well as the video, and if anyone has feedback, feel free to contact us before next week. So thank you everyone again.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks a lot, guys and then girls and everybody.
Nice to see you, Kirk.
Good to see you, Kirk.
Hi, Kirk.
Hi.